Tonight, instead of opening a history book, you are opening a forgotten door that has remained quietly closed for centuries. Beyond it, you do not find a famous battlefield or a marble hall. You find a shoreline under a pale evening sky where grass bends in the salt wind and old paths disappear beneath sand. Somewhere beyond the dunes, houses once stood close enough for neighbours to call to one another. Boats scraped against wooden landings, lamps glowed behind small windows while gulls circled above the water. Before tonight's forgotten story quietly unfolds, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy relaxing journeys through history. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Tonight you wander through places. America, slowly misplaced villages, washed away, streets covered by forests, towns flooded beneath reservoirs, and settlements remembered only by stones or old names on maps. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let history quietly unfold around you. You begin where land and water never completely agree about where one should end and the other should begin. Along the Atlantic coast, islands have always been temporary in ways inland towns rarely need to consider. Sand moves, channels shift, storms rearrange beaches. A harbour that feels protected for one generation can become exposed for the next. When you stand on a barrier island during a calm evening, the dunes seem solid beneath your feet while marsh grass whispers steadily nearby. Yet entire communities have lived on ground that was quietly moving all along. Off Virginia's eastern shore, you find one of the clearest examples. Hog Island once held the community of Broadwater tucked among maritime woods and sandy ground. You can picture modest houses, fences leaning into the wind, boats pulled near shore, and narrow paths pressed into the soil by familiar footsteps. For residents, the island was not an exotic wilderness. It was simply home. Families depended heavily on fishing, hunting gardens, livestock boats, and their knowledge of surrounding waters. You learnt to notice changes in wind before leaving shore. You watched clouds carefully and remembered which channels were deep where shoals had shifted, and how an inlet changed after rough weather. During the early 20th century, storms and erosion increasingly threatened life on Hog Island. A destructive storm in 1933 accelerated the departure of residents. Buildings were abandoned, dismantled, or moved, and families relocated to the mainland. Eventually, Broadwater ceased to exist as a living community. There is something strangely peaceful about one method they used to leave. Some wooden houses were moved by barge across the water. You imagine a familiar home floating slowly towards the mainland, its windows shut and rooms temporarily empty. The kitchen floor still carries scratches from chairs, yet beneath the house is no foundation now, only a platform, a boat, and moving water. The building survives while its address disappears. This becomes your first quiet lesson about forgotten American places. A town does not always leave ruins behind. Sometimes pieces of it are carried away and reused elsewhere. Hog Island also reminds you that a map captures only one moment. Barrier islands can migrate as waves, storms, wind, and currents move enormous amounts of sand. Researchers studying Virginia's barrier islands have documented dramatic shoreline changes over time. Ground that once held buildings may later become beach marsh or open water. That makes historical reconstruction difficult. You may know approximately where a house stood, yet the modern coastline no longer matches the coastline its residents knew. Old charts help, but the island has continued changing. Historians can recover names, photographs, memories, and property descriptions while still remaining uncertain about the exact position of every vanished path and building. The geography itself has edited the archive. Farther north, you encounter similar stories along New England's coast. Small island communities depended on fishing, lighthouse work, farming, quarrying, or coastal trade. Some survived for centuries. Others declined because industries moved, transportation changed, harbours became less useful, or mainland life became easier. A place did not need one final catastrophe to disappear. You notice how often ordinary institutions reveal the process. When only a few families remain, a school becomes difficult to maintain. When the school closes, families with children may leave. A store receives fewer customers. A church gathers fewer neighbours. Boat service becomes less frequent. An island can become empty, one household at a time. On abandoned home sites, plants may preserve memories longer than buildings. Old fruit trees, lilacs, or other domestic plantings can survive near former foundations. You walk through tangled grass and notice blossoms where no house now stands. Someone once selected that place, dug into the soil, planted something useful or beautiful, and expected to return next spring. The landscape keeps small memories better than you might expect. Broken ceramics, nails, shells, buttons, and animal bones can also reveal details of daily life that formal records overlooked. Archaeologists study such material because an ordinary fragment may hint at trade diet construction or household habits. But the coast is an impatient archive. Salt water corrodes metal. Sand buries one layer and exposes another. Storms scatter objects. Erosion can remove archaeological deposits before they are fully studied. In some places, historians know a settlement existed but cannot reconstruct every doorway, fence, garden, or final season with certainty. I begin to understand that forgotten places are not always forgotten because people fail to remember them. Sometimes the evidence itself refuses to stay still. As evening settles over the Atlantic, you imagine a vanished island street before its disappearance. A wooden landing reaches into shallow water. Nets hang to dry. A small boat taps softly against a piling. Inside a weathered house, someone trims a lamp wick while supper cools nearby. The air smells of salt smoke, damp wood, and rope. None of this seems important enough for a monument. That is precisely why you notice it. People in these places spent most of their lives doing things history rarely records. You see them repairing roofs, carrying water, tending gardens, mending nets, and watching children grow. They counted storms, stored winter fuel, and waited for letters from the mainland. Their world was small in scale yet complete. You pause near a dune as the last light turns the water silver. Somewhere beyond the shore may lie the former footprint of a house or road. Perhaps its exact position is no longer known. The tide continues without ceremony, smoothing the sand and softening the edge of every mark. Behind you grass bends in the wind, and as you leave the coast you carry one quiet idea inland. A place does not need to vanish completely to become forgotten. Sometimes it only needs to stop appearing on the routes people travel. Ahead, beyond the salt marsh and the darkening road forests are waiting. Inside them old stone walls run between trees. Cellar holes collect autumn leaves, and entire New England villages have been slowly hidden beneath roots and moss. Section 2. You leave the Atlantic shoreline behind and move inland where the sound of waves slowly gives way to wind passing through branches. The road narrows. Stone walls begin appearing beside you, low and uneven, beneath layers of moss. Some run straight through the forest with no obvious purpose. Others disappear beneath ferns, fallen leaves, and young maple trees. At first, they seem like ordinary boundaries. Then you notice something strange. The walls continue deep into places that now look completely wild. You walk farther beneath oak, beech, maple, and pine, and the forest begins revealing shapes that do not belong entirely to nature. A shallow rectangular depression appears beside the trail. Nearby, several stones form a rough line. An old apple tree leans toward an opening in the canopy, its twisted branches still producing small fruit. You are standing where a house once stood. Across New England, abandoned farmsteads and former rural settlements remain hidden inside forests that grew back after people left. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, large areas of Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and neighboring regions were cleared for farms and pasture. The landscape you see today would have looked remarkably different. Instead of continuous woodland, you might once have seen fields stretching between stone walls, cattle grazing on hillsides, smoke rising from chimneys, and narrow roads connecting scattered households. Wooden barns stood beside small homes. Orchards occupied sunny slopes. Children walked towards one-room schools while adults worked fields that demanded almost constant attention. Many of those farms eventually disappeared. One reason was simply the land itself. New England soil can be rocky, uneven, and difficult to cultivate. Each spring, farmers encountered stones pushed upward through the soil by freezing and thawing. Those stones had to be removed from fields if plows and crops were to survive. So you begin to understand the walls around you. They were not always built primarily as decoration or grand property markers. Many were practical places to put stones cleared from fields. Over years and generations, the piles became boundaries separating pastures, roads, woodlots, and neighboring farms. Today they remain after the farms themselves have vanished. You run your hand along a rough granite surface. Lichen covers one side. Damp leaves collect between the stones. A chipmunk disappears into a gap that may once have been filled by smaller rocks. The wall has become part of the forest now, but it began with human labor. As the 19th century continued, life began changing. Better farmland opened farther west. Industrial towns offered wages that did not depend on rocky hillsides or unpredictable harvests. Railroads altered patterns of trade and travel. Young people increasingly left isolated farms for factories, cities, western land, or other opportunities. A household might remain occupied for another generation. Then perhaps only the parents stayed. Eventually a roof began leaking. A barn sagged. Fields became pasture and pasture became brush. Saplings appeared beside abandoned walls. Within decades, forests returned so thoroughly that a traveller unfamiliar with the history might assume the land had always looked this way. This is one of the most surprising facts about rural New England. Many mature forests are younger than the abandoned human landscapes beneath them. You continue walking until you find another cellar hole. It is deeper than the first, lined with stone and partly filled with leaves. You imagine a wooden house resting above it long ago. The cellar would have provided storage and a cooler space for food. Barrels, root, vegetables, jars, tools, or winter supplies might once have been kept below the floorboards. Now rainwater gathers there after storms. In autumn, the depression becomes a bowl of red and gold leaves. Old cellar holes can be among the strongest clues that a farmstead once occupied a place. Chimneys collapse, timber rots, roof shingles vanish, yet stones remain quietly outlining where people once slept, cooked, argued, repaired clothing, cared for children, and listened to winter wind against wooden walls. Nearby domestic plants sometimes tell another part of the story. You notice lilacs growing where the forest otherwise seems random. Farther on, an apple tree stands alone among younger hardwoods. Such plants may survive long after the people who planted them disappeared. An orchard can outlive a family. Even after pruning stops, trees may continue flowering each spring. You picture an early May morning 2 centuries ago. White blossoms cover the branches. Bees move between flowers. Damp soil smells fresh after rain. Somewhere nearby, someone carries a wooden bucket toward a well while another person opens the barn door. The scene feels ordinary. That ordinary quality makes it easy for history to lose. Some abandoned communities became nearly invisible because they never developed into large towns. They might have contained only a handful of farms, a schoolhouse, perhaps a small meeting place, a mill, and several roads. When residents departed, there were few permanent structures to preserve. Wood returned to the soil. Names faded from daily speech. Roads narrowed until trees grew across them. Old maps sometimes preserve these places better than the modern landscape does. A road marked clearly on an 18th or 19th century map may now be nothing more than a shallow corridor between trees. You follow one such imagined road. Its surface is soft beneath your steps. Once wagon wheels would have cut grooves through mud here. Hooves struck stones. In winter, runners from sleighs passed over packed snow. Neighbours met along the route and exchanged news that had travelled slowly from village to village. Perhaps someone carried flour from a mill. Perhaps another person brought a letter. The road was once a thread connecting homes. Now it leads quietly through trees. Historians can often identify former settlements through property deeds. Census records, tax lists, maps, family papers, and archaeological remains. Yet uncertainty still surrounds many details. You may know who owned a farm, but not exactly how each room was used. You may locate a cellar, but remain unsure whether a nearby stone pile belonged to a barn shed or earlier structure. Oral traditions can preserve useful memories, yet stories also change as generations pass. The forest hides evidence while also protecting it. That contradiction follows you as you continue. In some places, abandoned roads and foundations survive precisely because later development never reached them. A forgotten farm beneath woodland may remain less disturbed than a site beneath a parking lot or modern neighbourhood. Moss can conceal history while preserving its shape. You pause beside another wall as afternoon light filters through leaves. The stones glow softly where sunlight reaches them. Somewhere above, a woodpecker taps against a trunk. The air smells of pine needles, damp earth, and distant rain. I begin noticing the forest differently. A straight line of stones is no longer just a wall. A strange depression is no longer simply uneven ground. An old apple tree becomes a witness. You imagine the final family leaving one of these farms. Perhaps they load furniture onto a wagon. Perhaps they take cooking pots, bedding tools, and photographs while leaving behind objects too heavy or useless to move. The door closes. The road remains. For a few years, neighbours still remember who lived there. Later children know only that a house once stood beyond the hill. Then even that memory grows faint. The forest completes the work slowly. Roots widen beneath foundations, leaves fill cellars. Trees shade former gardens, animals travel through old doorways without knowing there were ever doors. And yet the place is not entirely gone. You can still read it if you know what to look for. As evening approaches, you follow the old road westward. The trees thin slightly, and beyond them you hear water moving through a narrow valley. Long before highways carried people across these hills, other routes connected distant communities. Wagon roads, turnpikes, stagecoach tracks, and deeper in the mountains ahead, forgotten settlements wait among ridges, where families once built lives far from the coast. Section 3. You leave the old New England road behind and continue southwest following the long folds of the Appalachian Mountains. The landscape changes gradually. Forests become deeper. Ridges rise in layers blue and grey in the distance. Creeks wind through narrow valleys where mist lingers in the morning and wood smoke once settled close to the ground. You move along a path that seems almost too small to have mattered. Yet paths like this once connected homes, mills, churches, schoolhouses, and tiny communities spread across the mountains. In many Appalachian hollows, families lived far from large towns for generations. A hollow, often pronounced holler in local speech, could be a narrow valley tucked between steep ridges, sometimes with only enough flat ground for a road, a creek, a few houses, and small fields. You can imagine why such places became worlds of their own. The mountains made travel slow. A journey that looked short on a map could require climbing steep slopes, crossing streams, or following winding roads around ridges. Before modern highways, visiting a neighbouring valley might take much of a day. So families learned to use what was close at hand. You notice the practical intelligence everywhere. A house stands near water but above the floodplain. Corn grows in one patch of sunlight. Beans climb wooden poles. Fruit trees occupy another slope. Chickens wander near a weathered porch. Nothing is placed carelessly. Mountain families often combined small-scale farming with hunting, gathering timber, work crafts, and occasional wage labour. Corn became especially important because it grew reliably in many upland areas and could be stored ground into meal or fed to animals. Nearby forests supplied more than timber. People gathered berries, nuts, mushrooms, medicinal plants, and wild greens. Chestnuts were once particularly valuable before chestnut blight devastated the American chestnut during the 20th century. You pause beneath the spreading branches of an imagined chestnut tree. The tree would have been enormous. Before the blight mature, American chestnuts could dominate Appalachian forests, producing nuts for people and livestock and providing strong rot-resistant wood for buildings, fences, furniture, and tools. For many mountain communities, losing the chestnut changed more than the appearance of the forest. It changed daily life. You continue deeper into the valley. A narrow wooden footbridge crosses a creek. Water moves over stones with a constant low sound. Somewhere nearby, a hand-built spring house sits partly shaded by trees. Spring houses were simple but ingenious. Where cold spring water flowed reliably, families sometimes built small structures around or beside it. Milk, butter, and other foods could be placed in containers near the cool water, helping them remain fresh before electric refrigeration. You step inside one. The air feels immediately cooler. Stone walls hold the dampness. Water slides quietly through a shallow channel. Outside, summer insects hum in the heat, but inside the springhouse the temperature remains pleasantly low. It is a small piece of everyday technology. No machinery, no wires, just water, stone shade, and careful observation. Farther along you find another feature common to many mountain settlements, a family cemetery. It rests on slightly higher ground beneath trees. The markers are modest. Some are carved stones. Others may once have been simple field stones with no inscription at all. Families often buried relatives on land near their homes, especially where formal cemeteries were distant. This means the landscape itself became a family record. A hillside might contain grandparents, children, neighbours, and earlier generations whose names slowly faded from memory. Some grave markers remain readable. Others do not. Historians sometimes struggle to identify unmarked burials or connect them to written records, especially in remote communities where documentation was incomplete. You stand quietly for a moment. Leaves move overhead. The mountains seem unusually good at keeping silence, but Appalachian isolation was never complete. This is one of the easy misunderstandings about forgotten mountain places. People were connected by roads, rivers, trade, marriage, seasonal work, churches, markets, and later railroads. News travelled, goods arrived, families moved in and out. The mountain shaped life without sealing it away. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, large timber and coal companies moved into many parts of Appalachia. Rail lines entered valleys that had previously been difficult to reach. New settlements appeared quickly. Some were company towns built near mines or logging operations. Houses stood in rows along hillsides. A company store supplied food, clothing, tools, and household goods. Trains carried coal timber workers' mail and manufactured products through places that had once heard mostly wagon wheels and creek water. You can almost hear the transformation. A locomotive whistles beyond the ridge. Axes strike trees. A sawmill works beside the river. The valley becomes busier. For some families, wage labour brought new opportunities. For others, it created dependence on industries controlled from far away. When a mine closed or timber was exhausted, A settlement could shrink almost as quickly as it had grown. That pattern created many forgotten Appalachian places. A town might flourish for 20 years. Then work disappeared. Families left. The school closed. The store locked its doors. Vegetation moved back toward the road. You walk through one such imagined settlement after everyone has gone. The company houses are beginning to lean. A porch has collapsed beneath wet leaves. Rust stains an old metal hinge. A stone chimney stands alone where the rest of a house has disappeared. The silence feels larger because you know how noisy the place once was. Children once ran between these buildings. Laundry moved in the wind. People talked from porches in the evening. Someone carried groceries home from the store. Someone else waited for a shift to end. Not every abandoned Appalachian community vanished because of industry. Some families were displaced when land became part of parks, reservoirs, forests, or other public projects. In certain areas, authorities purchased properties and residents moved away, leaving behind foundations, orchards, cemeteries, and roads. The reasons were complicated. Records may describe property transfers clearly, while family memories preserve very different feelings about leaving. Historians can document dates, ownership, and official decisions, yet it is harder to measure what a household felt when it packed the final wagon or truck. That uncertainty stays with you. A place can disappear from a map while remaining vivid in someone's memory for decades. You notice another old house site beside the creek. Only the chimney remains. Near it grows a patch of daffodils. This seems almost impossible. The house is gone, but every spring the flowers will return. Daffodils and other long-lived garden plants often survive around abandoned home sites, sometimes becoming clues to former habitation. You kneel beside the leaves. Perhaps someone planted them near a doorway. Perhaps they marked the edge of a garden. No record explains it. The flowers simply continue. Evening settles into the hollow. The air smells of damp earth, leaves, and wood. Frogs begin calling near the creek. A thin layer of mist gathers over the water. You look back at the chimney, the flowers, the old road, and the dark shape of the ridge above. Once again, the forgotten place has not truly vanished. It has only changed languages. Where documents become thin stones speak. Where houses disappear, plants remain. Where names fade, roads still follow the shape of the land. You continue towards the sound of moving water. Ahead, valleys widen and rivers begin to carry you toward another kind of forgotten America where whole communities were not merely abandoned. They were deliberately covered. Beneath quiet reservoirs, old roads still descend into water, and form a town's rest where fish now move above rooftops that no longer exist. Section 4. You follow the widening valleys until the sound of mountain creeks becomes the deeper, steadier presence of a reservoir. At first, the water seems peaceful. Morning mist drifts above the surface. Forested hills descend toward the shoreline. A few birds move across the pale sky, and somewhere far away a boat leaves a faint silver line behind it. Nothing suggests a town once stood below. Yet beneath reservoirs across the United States, old roads continue downward into water. Foundations rest under silt. Former fields lie beneath dark currents. In some places, cemeteries were moved before flooding began. In others, almost every visible trace of daily life disappeared beneath a new lake. You stand near the shore and try to imagine the valley before the water arrived. Instead of a reservoir, you see a river. Beside it are farms, barns, churches, schools, small stores, bridges, orchards, and homes built on ground families may have occupied for generations. A road crosses the valley floor. Children walk along it. A wagon moves slowly towards town. Someone opens a shop door on a cool morning and sweeps dust from the wooden steps. Then surveyors arrive. Maps are drawn. Measurements are taken. The valley has been chosen for a dam. During the 20th century, large dam projects transformed many American landscapes. Dams promised electricity, flood control, irrigation, navigation, water storage, or several of these benefits at once. But reservoirs required space, and that space was often already occupied. You move slowly through the imagined valley while notices begin arriving at homes. Property must be purchased. Families must relocate. Roads will close. Buildings will be demolished or moved. The dates are official and carefully recorded, but the emotional experience is much harder to measure. A government document may list the value of a house. It cannot easily describe what it feels like to leave the tree your grandfather planted beside the porch. In some reservoir projects, entire communities were relocated. Residents received compensation, though disagreements over property values and fairness were common. Some people moved only a few miles, others scattered much farther. The community survived in memory, but not always in geography. That distinction matters. A town is more than its buildings. It is the familiar distance between a home and a store. It is the person who rings a church bell. It is the shortcut children use to reach school. It is knowing which neighbour owns the loud dog and which field floods after heavy rain. When families are dispersed, those patterns disappear. You imagine the final weeks before one valley is flooded. Furniture is carried from houses. Doors are removed. Useful may be salvaged. Old machinery is loaded onto trucks. People return to insect rooms that already feel abandoned. The silence inside them seems as unfamiliar. A kitchen once filled with conversation now holds only dust and a few marks where shelves used to hang. Outside an orchard still produces fruit. That feels almost unfair. Trees continue their seasonal rhythm even when the people who planted them know they will not return. One of the more unusual details of reservoir construction involved cemeteries. When flooding would cover burial grounds, graves were sometimes carefully relocated to new cemeteries on higher ground. You picture this work proceeding slowly. Records are checked. Markers are matched to names. Families may be contacted. The dead are moved before the living landscape disappears. It is a strange reversal. A person may have been buried beside family land with every expectation of remaining there permanently, only to be moved decades later because the valley itself is about to vanish beneath water. Not every burial was always clearly identified. Older graves could be unmarked. Records might be incomplete. Wooden markers may have disappeared long before relocation began. Here historians and archaeologists encounter uncertainty. They may know that a cemetery existed but remain unsure about the exact number of burials or the identity of everyone interred there. The reservoir keeps some answers beyond reach. You continue towards the old road. Before flooding, engineers may have rerouted highways and rebuilt bridges on higher ground. Rail lines sometimes had to be moved as well. Old routes became useless. A familiar road simply ended at the future shoreline. Then the gates of the dam closed. The river began to rise. This transformation did not happen in a single dramatic instant. Water climbed slowly. A low field disappeared first, then fences, then the old road. Tree trunks stood briefly in shallow water before being removed or submerged. The river widened into something that did not yet look like a lake. Day after day, the valley changed shape. You imagine standing on a hillside and watching a familiar landscape vanish by the inches. A barn disappears behind the waterline. The bend in the road is gone. A bridge becomes an island and then sinks from view. Eventually, the valley is silent beneath a broad surface reflecting clouds. The reservoir looks permanent, but sometimes drought reveals what was hidden. When water levels fall far enough, old foundations can emerge. Stone walls reappear. Roads become visible as pale lines across exposed mud. Tree stumps that have been underwater for decades stand again beneath the sun. People walk carefully across the lake bed. For a few weeks, history returns. You might see the outline of a building without knowing who last closed its door. You might follow a road that no longer connects to anything. These moments attract curiosity because they make the lost landscape suddenly understandable. The underwater town stops being an idea. It becomes a place with corners, distances, and paths. Yet even when structures survive, water changes them. Wood decays, metal corrodes, silt covers floors, currents rearrange smaller objects. The longer the reservoir remains, the harder it becomes to reconstruct ordinary details. A photograph may show a farmhouse but not exactly where every outbuilding stood. A map may identify a school but not who sat beside whom on a winter morning. Official records explain why the dam was constructed. They rarely tell you which porch had the best evening light. This is where forgotten history becomes most intimate. You stand beside the present shoreline and imagine the reservoir drained away. The hills remain in the same places. That helps. You can mentally restore the valley between them. A church appears near a road junction. A few houses gather beside a store. Fields stretch towards the river. Smoke rises from a chimney. A dog crosses the road. Someone hangs washing in the morning sun. The scene is ordinary enough to feel alive. Then you look again. Only water remains. Reservoir towns reveal a different kind of disappearance from the island communities and forest settlements you have already visited. Those earlier places faded gradually through erosion, migration, economics, and time. Here disappearance could be planned, surveyed, scheduled, mapped in advance. People sometimes knew the exact year when their home would cease to exist as a usable place. There is something quietly unsettling about that precision. You know when the road will close. You know when the dam will begin holding water. You know which hillside will become shoreline. But knowing does not make leaving simpler. As afternoon light softens across the reservoir, you notice small waves touching stones near your feet. They make the same sound again and again. Behind you, a modern road climbs toward higher ground. A heads somewhere under the surface, an older road continues into darkness. Perhaps its pavement is cracked now. Perhaps nothing remains except the roadbed. Still, you can imagine following it. It would lead past drowned fields and former yards, then toward a crossroads where people once stopped to talk. Beyond that, another route would climb away from the river, and roads are where your journey naturally turns next. Because long before reservoirs, covered valleys, forgotten roads carried Americans through mountains, forests, and distant settlements connecting places that would otherwise have remained almost completely apart. Section 5. You leave the reservoir behind and follow the old road as it rises into higher country. At first, the route looks ordinary. It curves through trees, crosses a shallow stream, and climbs toward a ridge where the morning air is cooler. Yet the farther you walk, the narrower the road becomes. Gravel gives way to packed earth, grass pushes inward from both sides. Soon you realize you are no longer following a modern road at all. You are walking along one of the forgotten routes that once carried people through the mountains. Before railroads and highways straightened journeys across the United States, travel often depended on roads that followed the shape of the land. They curved around steep slopes, searched for shallow river crossings, climbed through mountain gaps, and descended carefully into valleys. Distance mattered, but terrain mattered more. A route of 20 miles could become a full day's travel if the road was muddy, steep, or broken by streams. Travelers learned to measure a journey not only in miles, but in hills, bridges, ferries, and places where horses could rest. You can still see traces of that thinking beneath your feet. The road avoids the steepest ground. It follows a ridge for a while, then drops gradually toward water. Wagon wheels once pressed into this surface, cutting grooves that deepened during wet weather. Hooves churned mud, loose stones rolled downhill. Travel was rarely smooth. A passenger sitting inside a stagecoach felt every rut. You imagine the sound first. Leather, harness creaks, iron rim strikes stone. Horses breathe heavily as they climb. Inside the coach, travelers lean with every turn while luggage shifts above them. The pace seems slow by modern standards, but these roads once carried nearly everything that kept distant communities connected. Mail moved along them. So did doctors, merchants, preachers, craftsmen, government officials, travelers, livestock, tools, newspapers, and news from places far beyond the mountains. A road could change your settlement simply by passing near it. At important crossroads, small businesses appeared. A tavern might offer food, drink, and a place to sleep. A blacksmith repaired horseshoes, wagon parts, and tools. Stable hands changed tired horses. Travelers exchanged rumors while waiting beside a fireplace. You approach one such imagined stop near a mountain pass. The building is simple. Its walls are timber or stone. A wooden sign moves gently in the wind. Horses stand near a rail and smoke rises from a chimney. Inside the room smells of damp wool, wood smoke, leather, and stew. You sit near the fire. A traveller may have spent the night sharing a room with strangers because private accommodations were limited. Beds could be crowded, floors uneven, and comfort modest. Yet after hours on a rough road, almost any roof felt welcoming. These roadside inns became small islands of conversation. Someone arriving from the east might describe prices in a distant town. Another traveller carried a newspaper already several days old. A merchant complained about mud. A farmer asked about a bridge farther ahead. Information moved almost at the speed of horses. That made the road itself part of the communication system. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many regions developed turnpikes, privately operated toll roads intended to improve travel. Companies received permission to build or maintain routes and then collected fees from users. You soon notice a wooden gate ahead. Beside it stands a small toll house. The arrangement explains the name. A barrier, sometimes called a pike, could be turned aside after the traveller paid the required toll. Rates varied. A person walking might pay little or nothing, while wagons, livestock, or larger vehicles could cost more. The money was supposed to support road maintenance. That sounds straightforward. In practice, maintenance remained difficult. Rain washed away surfaces. Frost damaged roads. Heavy wagons created deep ruts. Bridges needed constant repair. Mountain routes were especially vulnerable because water rushed downhill during storms. So even a toll road might remain rough. You continue walking and find one of the most unusual traces left by old travel. The road has become hollow. Its surface lies several feet below the surrounding ground, bordered by raised banks and roots. This kind of sunken path could develop after decades of traffic erosion and repeated use. Wheels loosened soil. Rain carried it away. Hooves disturbed the surface again. Slowly the road sank into the landscape. Now trees grow on both sides and the old route resembles a shallow green corridor. You place your hand against an exposed root. People once passed through this exact space in both directions, perhaps for generations. Some roads became famous, many did not. A local wagon route could be vital to a handful of communities without ever appearing in national histories. It connected a mill to several farms or a mountain village to the nearest market town. When another road offered easier travel, the old one began fading. That process could happen surprisingly quickly. A new bridge changed the preferred river crossing. A railroad station opened in a neighboring valley. A better turnpike avoided the steep mountain pass. Later paved highways followed completely different grades. Traffic shifted. The roadside tavern lost customers. The blacksmith moved. Grass appeared between wagon tracks. The road stopped being maintained. Within a generation, people might describe it as the old road. A generation later, it became a trail. Eventually, the forest returned. I begin to notice how much abandoned transportation infrastructure survives beneath vegetation. Stone bridge abutments stand beside streams with no bridge between them. Culverts remain under paths rarely used. Retaining walls support roads that lead nowhere. Sometimes only a line of stones marks the edge. Elsewhere, old milestones survive. Before standardized road signs, travelers occasionally relied on stone markers indicating distances to important towns or destinations. Imagine approaching one in winter. Snow lies across the road. The horses are tired. Evening is coming quickly. A carved number tells you that the next town is 6 miles away. 6 miles sounds close. On a steep road beneath falling snow, it might feel very far. You continue toward an abandoned stage route. During the stagecoach era, scheduled services connected towns across expanding networks. Horses could be changed at stations along the route, allowing coaches to continue without waiting for the same animals to recover. Changing teams required organization. Fresh horses had to be ready. Drivers needed to know the road. Stable workers cared for animals while innkeepers served passengers. A seemingly simple journey depended on many people whose names rarely appeared in histories. You picture one of those stable workers before sunrise. The air is cold. Lantern light falls across hay and wooden stalls. Horses shift quietly while harness is prepared. The coach arrives in darkness. Passengers stretch stiff legs. Mail sacks are transferred. Fresh horses are attached. Within a short time, the coach leaves again. The stable worker disappears from the historical record, but the journey could not continue without that labor. This is another pattern you begin to recognize. Forgotten places were often supported by forgotten occupations. Road keepers cleared fallen branches. Ferry operators moved travelers across rivers. Innkeepers prepared beds. Blacksmiths repaired wheels. Stable hands cared for animals. Bridge tenders watched crossings. Each person maintained one small section of a large system. Exactly how busy some old roads were can be difficult to determine. Toll records may survive for certain routes, but many local roads left little documentation. Maps sometimes disagree about names or alignments. Roads were rerouted, renamed, or widened over time. A modern highway may even cover part of an older route. Elsewhere, historians know a road existed, but remain uncertain about its precise course through a forest. You pause where two faint paths divide. Which one carried the wagons? Perhaps both did at different times. The landscape keeps the question open. Evening comes slowly across the ridge. Light filters between trees and falls in long stripes across the abandoned road. Dry leaves shift beneath your steps. Somewhere below, water moves through the valley. For a moment, you imagine the road alive again. A wagon approaches around the bend. A bell sounds faintly from a horse's harness. Someone raises a hand in greeting. Dust hangs briefly in the warm air. Then the image passes. Only the quiet track remains. You continue downhill, following the route toward flatter country. The mountains open behind you, and ahead, a narrow ribbon of water runs beside an unusually level path. Soon you notice stone walls built into the bank. Then a wooden structure shaped like a gate. The old road has brought you to another forgotten network. Not one built for wagons. This one was built for boats, 2 ropes, lock keepers, and patient animals walking mile after mile beside still water. The canal towns are waiting ahead. Section 6. You follow the level path beside the water, and the landscape becomes strangely quiet. The canal hardly moves. Its surface reflects the sky in long pieces of grey and blue. Grass grows close to the edge. In places, stonework still holds the banks together, though roots now press between carefully fitted blocks. The path beside you is broad enough for an animal to walk comfortably. Once that was exactly its purpose. Before railroads became dominant, canals offered one of the gentlest ways to move heavy goods across long distances. A loaded wagon struggled over rough roads and steep grades, but a boat floating in water could carry far more weight with much less effort. So Americans dug artificial rivers through forests, farms, and towns. You walk along what was once a towpath. A mule or horse would have moved here, slowly pulling a canal boat by a long rope. The animal walked on land while the boat followed through the water beside it. The rhythm was patient. Hooves pressed into packed earth. Harness leather creaked. Water slipped softly along the hull. A boat could move hour after hour without hurry, passing fields, warehouses, villages, and wooded banks. The entire landscape seemed arranged around a speed that allowed you to notice everything. You imagine riding on one of these boats. The canal is narrow enough that the opposite bank feels close. Trees lean over the water. A farmhouse appears briefly between branches. A child waves from a bridge. Then a lock comes into view. Canals could not simply climb hills, so engineers built locks to raise or lower boats between different water levels. You step closer to one. The stone chamber looks almost like a long rectangular room without a roof. Heavy wooden gates stand at each end. Water enters or leaves through carefully controlled openings. A boat moves inside. The gate closes behind it. Then the water level slowly changes. The boat rises without being lifted, or sinks without descending a ramp. It feels almost magical, though the principle is simple. Water does the work. Lock keepers became essential figures along canal routes. Many lived close to the lock because boats could arrive throughout the day and sometimes well into the night. You picture a lock keeper's house beside the water. It is modest with a small garden near the door. Smoke rises from the chimney. Boots dry beside the entrance. The lock keeper hears a boat approaching. Perhaps a horn sounds. He walks outside, opens the necessary gates, controls the water, and waits as the boat slowly changes level. Then the process begins again. The work could be repetitive, but repetition was part of the canal's dependable rhythm. Nearby a settlement might grow simply because boats had to stop. A warehouse appears first, then a stable, then an inn. A blacksmith opens a shop. Someone begins selling bread candles, rope tobacco, and animal feed. Soon the canal has created a town. You enter one of these places in the middle of the 19th century. The air smells of water, hay, flour, tar wood, smoke, and animals. Barrels stand beside the warehouse. Sacks of grain are stacked beneath an awning. Men roll cargo toward a boat while a mule drinks from a trough. The buildings face the canal because the canal is the town's main street. Goods arrive here before they move anywhere else. Flour travels toward growing cities. Coal moves toward factories. Timber, grain, iron, salt, and manufactured products pass in both directions. But canal boats carry more than cargo. They carry people. Some passengers travel in boats fitted with sleeping spaces, dining areas, or simple cabins. Others ride beside freight in less comfortable conditions. Travel is slow but often smoother than traveling over bad roads. At night, the boat continues beneath stars. You hear water brushing the hull. Inside, people settle into narrow sleeping spaces while the tow animal continues at a steady pace outside. Sometimes low bridges interrupt the calm. Passengers or crew members on top of a canal boat have to pay attention. Certain bridges offer very little clearance. A warning may be shouted as the boat approaches. People duck. The bridge passes overhead. Then everyone sits upright again. It is a small and slightly amusing inconvenience of canal travel. You can imagine experienced passengers barely looking up while newcomers react much too late. Life along the canal develops its own habits. Boat families may spend long periods traveling the same route. Children grow familiar with locks, bridges, towns, and stopping places. Some canal boats become temporary homes. Meals are prepared on board. Laundry dries where space allows. Children learn to move carefully around ropes, cargo, and water. The canal is workplace, road, and household all at once. Meanwhile, people living in canal towns adjust their schedules to the traffic. An arriving boat means business. A merchant watches for familiar captains. An innkeeper prepares food. Stable workers bring fresh animals. Warehouse laborers move cargo before another boat arrives. I begin to see how a narrow strip of water can reorganize an entire community. Then another sound appears in the distance. Not hooves, not water. A locomotive. Railroads begin competing with canals during the 19th century. And the difference in speed is difficult to ignore. Trains travel faster. They do not need a continuous water supply. They are less dependent on freezing weather. In northern regions, canals can become unusable during winter when ice forms across the surface. A railroad keeps moving. You imagine a canal merchant hearing the first trains passing through a nearby valley. At first, the canal remains busy. The old system still works. Boats keep arriving. Locks continue opening and closing. But patterns begin to shift. Some freight chooses rail. Passengers do the same. A warehouse receives fewer deliveries. A stable needs fewer animals. The change may take years, but everyone notices. Certain canals continue operating successfully for long periods, especially where they remain useful for heavy freight or regional trade. Others decline much more quickly. Smaller canal towns are especially vulnerable. If their reason for existing was the canal, what happens when the canal no longer matters? You walk along the towpath several decades later. The answer is visible. One warehouse is empty. Another has been converted to a different use. The inn has closed. Grass grows near the lock gate. A mule stable stands silent. The water remains, but the economy around it has changed. Some communities adapt. Roads replace towpaths. Factories occupy old buildings. Rail stations draw activity away from the canal. Other settlements slowly shrink. Their names survive on old maps, yet the places themselves become difficult to recognize. One unusual detail remains beneath your feet. Towpaths that once carried mules often survive because their gentle grades make useful modern trails. You can walk for miles along a route engineered for animals more than a century ago without realizing why the path is so unusually flat. The old transportation system continues shaping movement long after the boats disappear. You pass beside another abandoned lock. The wooden gates are gone. Only stone walls remain. Ferns grow between blocks once kept clear by constant use. Water trickles through cracks where controlled currents once raised loaded boats. Historians can often reconstruct major canal systems quite well from engineering plans, business records, maps, newspapers, and government documents. Yet the smaller details remain more uncertain. You may know how many boats passed a lock in a particular year, but not what an exhausted mule driver thought on a rainy evening. You may know the name of an inn, but not which rooms smelled of apples stored for winter. You may know where a warehouse stood, but not which child sat beside its door watching boats pass. Those details rarely entered official records. Still, the setting allows you to imagine the rhythm. Morning fog sits low over the canal. A lock gate opens. Water moves. A rope tightens. Hooves begin again along the towpath. For a few minutes, the entire forgotten system seems alive. Then the boat rounds a bend and disappears. You continue beside the water until the canal widens near a river. Beyond it, the land stretches westward. The air becomes cooler. The horizon feels broader. Ahead lie enormous inland waters where ships once entered small ports whose names have almost disappeared. There, along the Great Lakes, storms shifting, trade and changing shorelines would erase another collection of American communities. Bạn vừa hoàn thành Section 6, nên mình tiếp tục đúng mạch với Section C để không lặp nội dung. Section 7. You leave the quiet canal behind and continue toward a horizon that seems almost too wide to belong inland. At first you smell the water before you fully see it. The air grows cooler. Wind moves more freely across the open landscape. Gulls appear overhead and the low sound of waves begins replacing the gentle stillness of the canal. Then the trees open. Before you lies one of the Great Lakes. The water stretches so far that the opposite shore disappears completely. Clouds gather over a surface broad enough to resemble an inland sea. Waves move toward beaches, piers, and weathered harbour walls carrying the smell of cold water, wet timber, and distant rain. Along these enormous lakes, hundreds of settlements once depended on shipping. Some became major cities. Others nearly vanished. You follow the shoreline toward one of the smaller forgotten ports. A century and a half ago, it might have looked surprisingly busy. Wooden docks extend into the water. Warehouses stand close behind them. Barrels and crates wait beside piles of lumber. Sailboats and steam-powered vessels arrive from other lake ports carrying passengers, grain tools, coal-manufactured goods and news. A bell sounds near the harbour. Workers move cargo from a vessel. Horse-drawn wagons wait beside the pier. For a community surrounded by forests and difficult roads, the lake is not an obstacle. It is the highway. This becomes your first quiet fact of the Great Lakes. 4. Modern road networks water, transportation, often connected remote northern settlements more efficiently than overland travel. A town with a good harbour could suddenly become important. Timber might be cut many miles inland, floated or hauled toward shore, then loaded aboard ships. Grain from farming districts travelled through lake ports toward larger markets. Fishing supported families, merchants, boat builders, and processors. The waterfront determined the rhythm of the place. You imagine waking before sunrise in one such town. The lake is nearly black beneath the fading stars. Lanterns glow near the docks. A fisherman carries nets toward a boat while another person prepares bait. Somewhere inside a boarding house, breakfast is being cooked for men who will work along the waterfront. You smell coffee, smoke fish, and damp rope. The day begins early. But life beside the Great Lakes carries a particular uncertainty. The water changes quickly. A calm morning can become rough by afternoon. Winds travel across enormous distances with little to stop them, building waves that surprise inexperienced travellers. Autumn can be especially unsettled. You watch clouds thickening over the lake. The horizon disappears first. Then the wind becomes colder. Harbour workers begin securing loose equipment while captains study the sky. For the people living here, weather is not simply conversation. It determines whether ships arrive, whether fishing boats leave, whether cargo remains stranded, and whether families begin watching the horizon for someone expected home. The Great Lakes have experienced thousands of shipwrecks over centuries of navigation. Yet for tonight, you do not follow the dramatic stories of famous vessels. You remain on shore. You notice what repeated storms did to ordinary places. Wooden piers needed constant repair. Waves damaged harbour structures. Sand shifted around entrances. Channels became shallower. A port useful in one generation could become difficult for larger ships in another. That could quietly alter a town's future. You walk toward the mouth of a small river where early settlers once established a harbour. The location seemed sensible. Timber could come down the river. Ships could carry it onward across the lake. A sawmill appeared, then warehouses, then houses, stores, a church, and perhaps a small hotel for travellers. The settlement grew around movement, but ships did not remain the same size. As commerce developed, larger vessels needed deeper channels and stronger docks. Harbours with limited depth could lose traffic to better-equipped competitors. Railroads created another challenge. A railway line passing through a neighbouring town could redirect freight almost overnight. Suddenly goods that once arrived at the waterfront travelled somewhere else. The harbour grew quieter. You can almost hear the decline through absence. Fewer whistles, fewer wagons waiting near the docks, less shouting from warehouse doors, and in serves fewer travellers. A chandlery that once sold rope lamps, sailcloth, and other ship supplies closes its shutters. Nothing dramatic happens on one particular day. The town simply becomes less necessary. Farther along the lake shore, another force is working. Erosion. Waves remove sand and soil from exposed shores. Storms cut into dunes and bluffs. Houses once built a comfortable distance from the water may find the shoreline gradually approaching. You stand near the edge of a high bluff. Roots hang from exposed soil. Below, waves reach the base of the slope. A fence line stops abruptly where land has fallen away. Historical maps sometimes show streets or structures in places now occupied by open water. That makes the coastline itself another unreliable archive. Like the barrier islands you visited at the beginning of your journey, Great Lakes shores can move. Perhaps not every year in an obvious way, but decade after decade the difference becomes measurable. Some settlements also disappeared beneath moving dunes. Around parts of Lake Michigan, powerful winds have carried enormous quantities of sand inland, bearing roads, trees, and traces of human activity. You imagine a fence slowly shortening as sand gathers against it. First the lower boards vanish, then only the posts remain. Eventually even those disappear beneath the dune. A landscape can hide a settlement without destroying every part of it. This creates unusual archaeological possibilities. Buried features may survive beneath sand protected from later disturbance. Yet locating them can be difficult. Old descriptions may mention a hotel near the lake or a row of cabins beside a road, while the modern terrain offers few clues. Historians compare maps, property, records, photographs, newspapers, and archaeological evidence, but exact locations sometimes remain uncertain. The lake continues rearranging the evidence. You walk into an abandoned harbour settlement late in the afternoon. One substantial building remains. Perhaps it once served as a warehouse. Its timber is grey, now roughened by decades of weather. Rust marks the hinges, grass grows around the foundation. You touch the wood. It feels dry and splintered beneath your fingers. Nearby pilings emerge from shallow water. They form two imperfect rows extending from shore. Nothing rests on them now. But you can reconstruct the missing pier. A ship once tied up there. Workers rolled barrels across wooden planks. Children watched from shore. Someone waited for a relative arriving from another port. A pier was not simply infrastructure. It was where the wider world entered town. Another quiet detail survives in the architecture of some Great Lakes communities. Buildings were occasionally moved rather than abandoned. When towns shifted or shorelines changed, wooden construction made this possible. A house might be lifted, placed on rollers or supports, and relocated to safer or more useful ground. So as on Hog Island, far behind you a building could survive after its original neighbourhood disappeared. I begin to realise how misleading survival can be. A house may look as though it has always occupied one location. Its history may belong somewhere else entirely. As evening approaches, you continue along a former waterfront street. The original shoreline may have been farther out, or closer in. Old maps disagree slightly. Accounts from residents describe buildings that no longer exist. There are enough clues to know the community was real, but not enough to recover every detail. That uncertainty feels appropriate beside such restless water. You stop where the old harbour entrance once opened. The lake darkens gradually. Small waves strike stones with a soft repeated sound. Far offshore, a modern vessel appears as a tiny line beneath the fading light. You imagine an earlier ship following roughly the same horizon. Its destination was a port that no longer functions. Perhaps the captain knew the harbour master by name. Perhaps passengers recognized the church steeple before reaching shore. Those details have disappeared, but the water route remains. Behind you, grass covers former streets. Ahead, the continent begins opening into broad farmland. The forest thin. The sky grows larger, and beyond the Great Lakes, another collection of forgotten places waits beneath the prairie grass. They were built around promises printed on maps and advertisements. Some expected railroads, some expected settlers, some expected a future that simply chose another route. You turn west. Across the open plain streets were once surveyed before houses existed, and towns sometimes faded because a railway passed only a few miles away. Section 7 was completed in the previous turn, so I'll continue the journey with Section 8. Section 8. You leave the Great Lakes behind and continue west where the land begins to flatten beneath an immense sky. The change feels gradual at first. Trees become fewer, fields grow wider, roads run straighter. The horizon seems to move farther away with every mile until the landscape opens into broad stretches of prairie. Here distance behaves differently. A church steeple can be visible long before you reach the town beneath it. A grain elevator rises like a landmark from miles away. A single line of trees may reveal a creek, a farmhouse, or the edge of a settlement hidden beyond low ground. And across this open country, thousands of communities once placed their hopes in one particular sound: a train whistle. During the 19th century, railroads transformed the American interior with extraordinary speed. Tracks crossed farmland, connected distant markets, and created entirely new patterns of settlement. A town fortunate enough to receive a station could grow quickly. A town missed by the tracks might slowly disappear. You follow an old wagon road toward a small prairie settlement. On an early map, it looks promising. Several streets have already been surveyed. Lots are divided neatly into rectangles. A general store stands near the center, with a blacksmith shop nearby. A schoolhouse sits farther along the road. Perhaps 20 families live within walking distance. They have chosen the location because they believe something important is coming. The railroad. Rumors about future rail routes could influence land values long before construction began. Speculators purchased property. Town founders advertised opportunities. Businesses appeared in anticipation of travelers' freight and new residents. Sometimes the optimism was justified. Sometimes the railway went somewhere else. You imagine standing outside the store when the news finally arrives. Surveyors have selected a route several miles north. At first, nobody panics. Several miles does not sound far, but on the prairie a few miles can determine whether freight wagons stop here or somewhere else. Soon a station is built beside the tracks. A new settlement appears around it. You can almost watch the buildings migrate. A merchant decides he needs to be closer to the depot. The blacksmith follows the customers. A grain buyer opens an office near the tracks. Someone builds a hotel. A post office may eventually move as well. The old town remains in place, but its purpose begins slipping away. This happened often enough that some buildings were physically relocated. Wooden structures could be lifted onto skids or rollers and pulled toward a new town site by teams of horses. You picture the strange sight. A small house moves slowly across the prairie. Its windows are boarded or secured. The chimney may have been removed. People walk beside it while horses lean into their harnesses. The family has not moved out of the house. The house itself is moving. Sometimes stores, churches, and other structures travel the same way. A settlement could be dismantled without being demolished. By the time the new railroad town grows, pieces of the old one may already be standing along different streets. This leaves historians with an unusual puzzle. A surviving 19th century building might not occupy its original location. Local memory may preserve the move, but exact dates or routes are sometimes uncertain. You continue along the abandoned town's main street. There is no pavement. Only 2 faint wheel tracks remain beneath grass. You imagine what the street looked like before the railway decision changed everything. Horses stand near hitching posts. A wagon carrying flour stops outside the store. Inside shelves hold coffee, cloth nails, lamp oil, soap, tools, and jars of sweets. The store is more than a place to buy things. It is where information arrives. A farmer asks whether rain has fallen farther west. Someone reads a newspaper aloud. A traveler describes land prices in another county. A letter waits behind the counter. Then fewer people come. The new railroad town has a larger store. Its goods arrive faster. Prices may be lower because freight no longer requires a long wagon journey. The old merchant faces a quiet decision. Stay, move, or close. You continue toward the settlement schoolhouse. Prairie schools often served scattered farm families across large districts. Children walked or rode several miles to attend, especially before school consolidation became common. The building is small. 1 room, tall windows, a stove near the center for winter heat. Coats hang along the wall. In cold weather, someone arrives early to start the fire. The room smells of chalk, wool, wood smoke, and damp boots. Outside, the wind moves across open fields without interruption. A school might remain after the town itself weakened. As long as farm families still lived nearby, lessons continued. Later population shifts and consolidation closed many rural schools. Students began traveling by bus to large institutions. The little building was abandoned, converted into a house moved or simply left beside the road. You pass another foundation nearby. Perhaps it belonged to a church. Religious buildings often anchored prairie communities even when the population was small. Weddings, funerals, holiday gatherings, and Sunday services brought neighbors together from distant farms. When a community declined, the church sometimes became the last active institution. Then one winter, the congregation became too small. The doors closed. Another layer of the town fell silent. You stop near an old cemetery beyond the former settlement. Unlike wooden buildings, cemeteries often remained long after commercial streets disappeared. Grass grows between stones. A few markers lean. Some names are still clear. Others have been softened by weather. Here the town survives through surnames. Family names repeat across several rows, revealing generations of people who expected the community to endure. This is one reason forgotten prairie towns can feel so close to the surface. The buildings may be gone, but the cemetery remains visible from a gravel road. You can still stand among people who called this place home. The exact number of abandoned town sites across the plains and Midwest is difficult to define. Some were fully organized municipalities. Others were little more than planned settlements that never developed beyond a store post office or station. Maps can make them look larger than they ever were. A grid of streets might appear official, even if only a handful of buildings were constructed. This is where historians must be careful. A planned town is not always the same as a lived town. You might find advertisements promising hotels, factories, churches, and prosperous neighborhoods that never existed outside printed brochures. The future was sometimes more detailed on paper than on the ground. You walk toward the edge of the old settlement. Tall prairie grass brushes against your legs. Grasshoppers click somewhere nearby. The wind carries the faint smell of dry earth and harvested fields. Nothing interrupts the sky. It is easy to understand why settlers believed they were building something permanent here. The land seemed endless. A railroad promised connection to everything beyond it. Yet connection could be cruelly selective. One station grew. Another town faded. One grain elevator filled each autumn. Another store closed its doors. By the early 20th century, automobiles and improved roads began changing the pattern again. People could travel farther to shop. Small local businesses lost customers to larger towns. Farm mechanization reduced the number of workers needed on the land. Rural populations declined in many areas. The railway had once decided which towns prospered. Later highways and changing agriculture reshuffled the map again. You look across the grass toward a distant line of tracks. A train passes far away. From this distance it seems almost silent. For the people who lived in the abandoned town beside you, those tracks once represented an entire possible future. They imagined passengers stepping down onto a platform, warehouses filling with grain, new houses appearing along surveyed streets, perhaps even a hotel rising near the depot. Instead, the tracks went elsewhere. The prairie reclaimed the empty lots, yet the failure was never complete. A cemetery remained. A school photograph survived in someone's attic. A house was moved to another town. The old place name appeared in county histories and family stories. I begin to understand that forgotten towns often survive in fragments scattered far beyond their original streets. And as the evening light turns the prairie pale gold, you continue toward another kind of settlement. Ahead, small communities carry names from Germany, Sweden, Bohemia, Norway, Finland, and many other distant places. Their founders brought recipes, languages, church traditions, furniture styles, and memories across the ocean. On the American prairie, they tried to rebuild something familiar. The immigrant colonies of the Midwest are waiting just beyond the next rise. Section 9. You continue across the prairie until the towns begin to sound different. At first, the changes are subtle. A church steeple rises above a cluster of trees. A bakery window displays dark loaves beside small pastries. A painted sign carries a surname that seems to belong somewhere across the Atlantic. Then you hear another language. It drifts through an open doorway. Two older women speak while arranging vegetables outside a shop. Children answer them in English, but the rhythm of the older language remains in the air. You have entered one of the immigrant communities that reshaped the American Midwest. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of immigrants from Europe settled across states such as Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. They did not arrive as one uniform population. Some came from Germany. Others came from Norway, Sweden, Finland, Bohemia, Poland, the Netherlands, and many other regions. Each group carried something invisible across the ocean. Language, food, songs, religious custom, building traditions, ways of preserving winter vegetables, ideas about family life, even preferred shapes for barns and houses. You follow a dirt road toward a small settlement founded by families from the same region of Europe. The first homes are modest. modest. Some settlers build with timber because wood is available nearby. Others use stone brick or sod depending on local materials and the traditions they already know. A house does not need to copy the old country exactly. It only needs to feel slightly familiar. You step inside one. The room smells of bread, smoke, wool, and something sour fermenting in a crock near the wall. A heavy table stands near the center. A wooden chest contains clothing and important papers. On a shelf, you notice a ceramic bowl that may have traveled across the Atlantic, wrapped carefully among household belongings. Immigrant families often brought surprisingly ordinary objects with them. A Bible, a cooking pot, a spinning tool, a photograph, a clock, a set of linens. These things were not valuable because they were rare. They were valuable because they made an unfamiliar place feel connected to the one left behind. Outside the prairie stretches farther than many newcomers had imagined. For settlers from crowded European villages, the scale could feel almost unreal. Land appeared abundant. Neighbors might live much farther apart. Weather seemed larger too. Summer heat pressed across open fields. Winter winds moved without forests or mountains to slow them. Snow gathered against buildings. Families learned quickly that old habits sometimes needed adjustment. You continue toward the village church. It is one of the first substantial buildings in the settlement. In many immigrant communities, churches did far more than hold Sunday services. They helped preserve language, organize schools, support new arrivals, arrange social gatherings, and maintain connections between families. A pastor might preach in German, Norwegian, Swedish, Polish, Czech, or another language long after children in the community had begun speaking English elsewhere. You enter quietly. Wooden pews face a simple altar. Sunlight passes through plain windows. A stove waits near one wall for winter. The church smells faintly of old timber and candle wax. On Sunday mornings, wagons once arrived from surrounding farms. Families who had spent the week working separately suddenly gathered in one room. News travelled quickly here. Who had married? Who had bought land? Who was ill? Who had received a letter from Europe? Who was planning to leave for another town? The church kept the community connected. Nearby you find a school. For some immigrant families, education raised a delicate question. Which language should children use? At home, they might speak the language of their parents. At school, English became increasingly important. In some communities, religious or private schools continued teaching in immigrant languages for many years. Newspapers also appeared in German, Scandinavian languages, Czech, Polish, and others. This is one of the more easily forgotten facts about the Midwest. Many residents once read local news in languages other than English every morning. You imagine opening such a newspaper? It contains reports from nearby farms, advertisements for tools, notices from churches, marriage announcements, shipping information, political discussion, and perhaps news from Europe. The paper makes a distant place feel close. It also creates a small cultural world within the larger American one. You continue toward a kitchen where afternoon work is underway. Here history becomes especially fragrant. Food traditions traveled remarkably well. Families adapted recipes to American ingredients while preserving familiar methods. Cabbage might be fermented, meat smoked, bread shaped according to regional habits, dumplings simmered, pickles stored in crocks, cheese produced where milk was plentiful, coffee brewed strong. Certain dishes changed because ingredients were easier to obtain in America than they had been in Europe. Others changed because something familiar was missing. Recipes rarely remain perfectly frozen in time. They adjust quietly. You watch someone knead dough on a flour-covered table. She does not measure every ingredient precisely. Experience guides her hands. A little more water, a little more flour. The dough changes beneath her fingers. Some recipes survive this way for generations without ever being written down. That creates uncertainty for historians. A family may remember that a particular dish came from an ancestor's homeland, yet the version prepared a century later may contain ingredients or techniques developed in America. Tradition is often genuine even when it changes. You leave the kitchen and walk toward the edge of the settlement. Several barns stand beyond the houses. Their shapes are not identical. Architecture can preserve traces of migration just as language does. Different groups brought preferences for barn layouts, roof forms, house arrangements, decorative styles, and construction techniques. But buildings also responded to American conditions. Available timber mattered. Climate mattered. Cost mattered. Neighbors borrowed useful ideas from one another. So a building may contain several histories at once. You run your hand across a weathered barn door. Perhaps the builder followed a method learned from his father. Perhaps he copied a roof style from a neighbor of another background. Perhaps nobody recorded the answer. The structure remains, but the reason behind each decision may be lost. That quiet uncertainty follows you through the town. At the general store, several languages overlap. A recent arrival asks for something too slowly. The shopkeeper understands enough. Coins change hands. Children move between adults with much greater ease, translating when necessary. In many immigrant families, younger generations became cultural bridges. They learned English quickly through school and contact with the wider community. Parents sometimes depended on them for letters, business matters, or conversations with officials. You imagine a 12-year-old child reading a formal document aloud at the kitchen table. The adults listen carefully. The child suddenly carries responsibility beyond ordinary schoolwork. Language change often happened within only a few generations. Grandparents might speak mostly the old language. Parents spoke both. Grandchildren answered primarily in English. Eventually, phrases survived more easily than full conversations. A prayer, a recipe name, a greeting, a song, a family nickname. The settlement began sounding different. You notice the same change in celebrations. Festivals, once connected closely to a specific regional tradition, slowly become community events enjoyed by neighbors of many backgrounds. Food remains, music remain, costumes may appear on special occasions, but the original context gradually softens. Culture does not disappear. It becomes layered. During times of war or political tension, some immigrant communities also felt pressure to emphasize their American identity. German-speaking communities experienced especially strong suspicion during the First World War, and the public use of German declined sharply in many places. Schools changed languages. Newspapers closed or switched to English. Families sometimes altered names or stopped speaking German outside the home. A language that had once filled streets became quieter. You walk past an abandoned newspaper office. The windows are dusty now. Its printing press is gone. Yet decades ago, sheets of fresh paper emerged from this building, carrying local stories in words many descendants can no longer read easily. That feels like another kind of forgotten place. Not only a building, a vanished soundscape. You continue toward a cemetery at the edge of town. The stones reveal the transition clearly. Older inscriptions may use another language. Later ones use English. Traditional names gradually become anglicized. Birthplaces in Europe give way to birthplaces in Wisconsin, Minnesota, or Iowa. The distance between old country and new country becomes one generation shorter with every row. You pause beside a marker bearing dates separated by nearly 80 years. The person beneath it may have crossed an ocean as a child and died surrounded by grandchildren who considered the prairie entirely normal. Migration changed the landscape. The landscape changed the migrants. Evening settles gently over the settlement. Smoke rises from several chimneys. Somewhere bread is cooling. A church bell sounds once across the fields. The prairie wind moves through tall grass beside the cemetery. You realize that these communities did not simply reproduce Europe in America. They created something new from memory, necessity, climate distance, and time. Some grew into permanent towns. Others faded when railroad shifted, farms consolidated, or younger generations moved away. A church remains here. A bakery recipe survives there. A surname stays on a mailbox. A few words remain in a family vocabulary. History does not always preserve a whole culture in one place. Sometimes it scatters it into thousands of small inheritances. You leave the settlement as lantern light appears behind the windows. Farther ahead, another town rises against the darkening horizon. Its houses look unusually similar. The streets are carefully arranged. A factory chimney stands at one end. A company store sits near the center. Here the town was not built slowly by families following one another across an ocean. It was planned around a single source of work, and when that work disappeared, almost everything else was placed at risk. Section 10. You leave the immigrant settlement behind and follow the road toward a town that seems unusually orderly. The houses appear first. They stand in careful rows, similar in size, similar in shape, and spaced at nearly equal distances from one another. A store occupies a central corner. Beyond it, a schoolhouse, a church, and several larger buildings gather near the main road. Then you notice the factory chimney, or perhaps it is a mine tipple, or a sawmill. Whatever the industry, everything in this place seems to point toward it. You have entered a company town. Across the United States, especially during the 19th and early 20th centuries, companies built entire communities around mines, mills, factories, logging operations, rail yards, and other industries. These towns could appear quickly. A company discovered coal, timber, iron, or another valuable resource in a remote place. Workers were needed. Workers needed houses. Their families needed food, schools, churches, medical care, and places to gather. So the employer built nearly everything. You walk down the main street. On one side stand rows of workers' houses. On the other, a company store. Farther away, larger homes occupy slightly higher ground. The arrangement is not accidental. Housing often reflected rank. Managers might live in larger houses with better views or more space. Skilled workers sometimes received different housing from labourers. In some places, the town's geography quietly displayed the workplace hierarchy. You can read social structure from the street plan. A family's address may reveal more than where they slept. You pause beside one of the smaller houses. The porch is narrow. Laundry moves gently in the breeze. A pair of work boots rests near the door. Inside the rooms are simple but familiar. A stove provides heat. A table sits close to the kitchen. Children share bedrooms. A lamp burns in the evening while someone repairs clothing or prepares food for the next day. For many families, company housing offered something valuable. It could provide shelter close to employment in places where few houses had existed before. But the arrangement also created dependence. The same organization that paid your wages might own your home. It might own the store. It might control the land beneath the school and the road outside your door. Work and home were difficult to separate. You continue toward the company store. Its windows display flour, canned goods, boots, cloth tools, tobacco, household supplies, and small treats for children. In an isolated settlement, the store may be the easiest place to buy almost everything. Sometimes it is the only place. This creates one of the best-known features of company town life. In some mining and industrial communities, workers were occasionally paid partly in company-issued credit, often called scrip instead of ordinary cash. The scrip could be spent at the company store. Its usefulness outside the town might be limited. You imagine holding one of these tokens or paper notes. It looks almost like money. Inside the settlement, perhaps it functions like money, but its value depends heavily on the company that issued it. This system varied greatly from place to place and period to period. Not every company town used scrip in the same way, and not every worker experienced the system identically. That is where simple stories become complicated. Some families remembered company stores as expensive and restrictive. Others recalled moments when store credit helped them through difficult weeks. Official records may show prices and wages. They cannot completely recover how each household experienced dependence. You step inside. The wooden floor creaks. A clerk stands behind the counter. Customers ask for flour by weight, cloth by length, and nails by quantity. Children study jars of sweets. A worker may ask whether a purchase can be added to an account until payday. Everything is written down. The ledger becomes another quiet record of daily life. Not famous speeches, not grand decisions. Soap, beans, boots, lamp oil. History often becomes very human in account books. Outside a whistle sounds. The entire town seems to respond. In industrial communities, whistles or bells could organize the day with remarkable precision. One signal marked the beginning of a shift, another marked the end. Families learn to measure time by the workplace. You hear the whistle at dawn. Doors open. Men and women step into the street. Lunch containers are carried under arms. Children watch parents disappear toward the mill main or factory. Several hours later, the signal sounds again. The workforce returns. A town built around one industry develops a shared rhythm. Meal times align. Stores become busy after shifts. Porches fill in the evening. Sleep begins early for those returning before dawn. You follow the workers toward the industrial edge of town. If this is a coal community, rail cars wait nearby. If it is a lumber town, stacks of cut timber fill the yard. If it is a textile settlement, the mill windows stretch across a long brick building, where machinery creates a constant mechanical sound. The work itself changes from place to place. The dependence does not. Everything rests on the industry continuing. That can make prosperity feel solid until the moment it does not. A mine reaches less productive seams. A forest is cut over. A factory owner relocates production. Prices fall. New technology makes an operation unprofitable. A railroad changes its route. Then the town begins changing. At first, perhaps one shift is eliminated. Some families leave. A few houses become empty. The school has fewer children. The company store receives fewer deliveries. You can see the decline by looking at windows. One house is dark, then another. Grass grows longer around a third. The industry may continue for several more years, but everyone understands the direction. You walk toward a boarding house near the edge of town. Such buildings often housed unmarried workers, recent arrivals, or people who had not yet brought families. Inside, several men share rooms. Boots line the hallway. Clothing hangs near a stove to dry. Dinner is served at long tables. Conversation mixes accents from different regions and countries. Company towns frequently attracted migrants from far away. Workers might arrive from neighboring states, southern farms, eastern cities, Mexico, Italy, Poland, Wales, Slovakia, or many other places. The supposedly uniform town could contain remarkable cultural variety. Recipes traveled with workers. Music traveled. Languages mixed. Religious traditions found space wherever families settled long enough. The workplace created the town, but residents created its culture. That distinction becomes important. A corporation could build identical houses. It could not make identical households. One porch grows flowers in old tin containers. Another family keeps chickens behind the house. Someone paints a doorway. A child carves initials into a fence. People personalize controlled landscapes. You continue toward a recreation hall. Some companies sponsored baseball teams, bands, libraries, parks, clubs, or holiday events. Part of this could reflect genuine attempts to improve community life. Part could also encourage stability and loyalty among workers. Motives were often mixed. Historians can document what companies built. It is more difficult to determine precisely how residents interpreted those efforts. A company picnic might be remembered warmly by one family and cynically by another. Both memories may be sincere. You watch an imagined baseball game on a summer evening. Workers who spent the week beside machines or underground now stand beneath open sky. Children sit along the edge of the field. Someone sells lemonade. A small crowd cheers quietly. For a few hours, the town belongs less to the company and more to the people who live there. Then Monday comes. The whistle returns. Years pass. The industry eventually closes. You walk the same street afterward. The silence feels wrong. The chimney no longer smokes. Rails rust beneath weeds. The company store door is locked. Some houses have already been removed. Others remain because families purchased them or because moving them was not worthwhile. A church survives. Perhaps the cemetery remains too. The town becomes detached from the reason it was built. Some company communities adapted and became ordinary towns. Others nearly vanished. A few remain as historic districts, their rows of similar houses still revealing the original plan. But many survive only in foundations, photographs, and family stories. You stop beside a cracked sidewalk leading toward the abandoned plant. Weeds rise through the joints. The architecture still shows control and order, yet the traces of residence are softer. A rose bush beside an empty porch. A child's marble found near a step. A patch of rhubarb returning each spring. These details tell you something the company records cannot. People made homes inside a system designed around work. Even after the work disappeared, some pieces of home remained. The evening air cools. You leave the silent factory behind and continue westward. Ahead, another set of forgotten communities waits. These places were founded not by corporations, but by people seeking independence, land, safety, and opportunity. Across the plains and beyond, black families established towns of their own and built schools, farms, newspaper, churches, and businesses. Many of those communities are now barely remembered. Section 11. You leave the company town behind and continue across the broad interior of the country where the horizon once again stretches far beyond the road. The landscape feels open. Fields lie beneath a pale sky. Cottonwoods gather near water. A few distant buildings rise from the prairie, separated by more space than you expect. Then you notice a church. Beyond it stands a schoolhouse. A small cemetery rests farther uphill. These are the remains of another kind of American settlement. You have entered a town founded by black families seeking something that had long been denied to them: control over their own lives. During the years after the Civil War, thousands of African Americans left the South and moved westward in search of land safety work and greater independence. Some became known as exodusters. The name came from the biblical story of Exodus, and it captured the sense that migration could become a journey away from oppression toward a different future. Kansas became one of the most famous destinations. You follow a wagon road toward Nicodemus, founded in 1877 by black settlers in northwestern Kansas. Nicodemus became one of the best-known black communities established on the Great Plains after the Civil War. You imagine the first arrivals looking across the landscape. There are no mature city streets waiting for them, no rows of comfortable houses. The prairie stretches almost endlessly. Shelter must come first. Some early settlers lived in dugouts cut partly into the earth because timber was scarce and building materials were expensive. You approach one of these imagined homes. From a distance, it nearly disappears into the landscape. The walls are earth. The roof may be supported with poles, grass, and soil. Inside, the temperature feels more stable than the open air outside. Summer heat is softened. Winter wind has less surface to attack. It is not the elegant house promised in a promotional description, but it is shelter, and it belongs to the family living there. You sit near the doorway as evening light falls across the prairie. A cooking pot rests near the fire. Blankets are folded against one wall. Outside insects move through tall grass. The room is simple, yet the meaning of the place is enormous. For people whose parents or grandparents had lived under slavery, owning land carried a significance difficult to measure only in acres. A farm could represent independence. A house could represent permanence. A town could represent community on terms its residents helped define. You continue toward the center of Nicodemus. Gradually buildings appear. Stores, churches, a school. Businesses operated by local residents. The town develops institutions that make settlement feel less temporary. You hear the ordinary sounds that turn a collection of structures into a community. A hammer strikes wood. A wagon approaches. Children call to one another near the school. Someone opens a store early in the morning. A church bell carries across open land. This is not a story of one heroic figure. It is a story of many small decisions. Someone plants corn. Someone repairs a roof. Someone teaches children. Someone extends credit to a neighbor. Someone organizes a church gathering. A settlement survives because ordinary people repeatedly decide to keep it alive. That pattern appears in Black-founded communities across the country. Farther south, you encounter places such as Mound Bayou, Mississippi, established in the late 19th century by formerly enslaved people and their descendants. There, Black residents developed businesses, farms, schools, churches and professional institutions in an environment where racial discrimination shaped nearly every part of life beyond the town. Much farther west, communities would also emerge in Oklahoma, Texas, and California. Some became substantial towns, others remained small colonies. The details differed. The hope behind them often sounded similar. You walk along a dusty main street and notice something unusual. Almost every important role in town can be filled by Black residents. The shopkeeper, the teacher, the farmer, the minister, the carpenter, the newspaper editor, the doctor in communities large enough to support one. This matters because outside these towns, opportunities were often restricted by segregation, discrimination, and violence. Inside a Black-founded community, local institutions could create spaces for leadership that were difficult to find elsewhere. You pause near a newspaper office. Printing equipment fills the room. Sheets of paper carry local announcements, advertisements, political opinions, church news, and reports about neighboring settlements. Black newspapers were particularly important in many communities because they connected readers across enormous distances. A person in Kansas could learn about opportunities in Oklahoma. A family in Mississippi could read about migration farther west. A newspaper could help build a town before a newcomer ever saw it. That is one of the quieter powers of printed words. A place can exist in the imagination first. You unfold an imagined advertisement promising fertile land, community, and opportunity. The description sounds confident. Reality is harder. Rainfall may be uncertain. Money is limited. Crops fail. Railroad companies choose other routes. Banks refuse credit. Discrimination does not disappear simply because a town was founded by Black residents. Some communities endure despite these pressures. Others begin losing population. Nicodemus itself struggled when expected railroad connections failed to develop nearby. You have heard this story before. A railway line can determine whether a prairie town expands or becomes increasingly isolated. The lesson from Section 8 returns quietly. Geography matters. Transportation matters. A few miles can change a future. You walk toward a schoolhouse as afternoon light enters through tall windows. Education becomes one of the strongest foundations of these communities. Parents who had been denied educational opportunities often placed enormous value on schooling for their children. A classroom might contain students of several ages. Books are reused. Desks are simple. A stove provides heat during cold months. Yet the building represents more than literacy. It represents preparation for a future that parents hope will offer wider choices. You imagine a child practicing handwriting carefully. Outside, prairie wind presses against the walls. Inside, each letter becomes part of something larger. Community institutions also preserve social life. Churches hold worship services, but they also host meetings, meals, weddings, funerals, and celebrations. Fraternal organizations and women's clubs raise money and support neighbors. Families gather for picnics. Musicians play at community events. Children grow up knowing which porch belongs to which grandmother. These details rarely appear in broad national histories, but they are the life of the town. You follow a road toward the cemetery. Older stones lean slightly in the soil. Some inscriptions remain sharp. Others have become difficult to read. Names repeat. Families remain close even after several generations. Here historians encounter a familiar uncertainty. Records from smaller Black settlements can be incomplete. Businesses may have operated without leaving extensive archives. Homes may disappear without photographs. Oral histories preserve details that official documents overlooked, but memories can differ over dates, locations, and names. One person remembers a store beside the church. Another remembers it across the road. Perhaps the building moved. Perhaps both memories belong to different decades. You learn not to treat uncertainty as failure. Sometimes it is simply the shape of ordinary history. The town changes with time. Young people leave for larger cities. Farming becomes increasingly mechanized. Transportation improves, allowing residents to shop and work elsewhere. Some businesses close. The school district consolidates. The population shrinks. Yet decline does not mean disappearance. You stand in Nicodemus many decades after its founding and still find a community connected to the original settlers. Buildings and landscapes preserve part of the story. Descendants preserve another. That continuity makes the place unusual among the many western towns that vanished completely. Other black settlements have been less fortunate. A few survive mainly as cemeteries, road names, foundations, or scattered homes. Some places are remembered by descendants even when almost nothing visible remains. You walk through one such landscape at sunset. Grass grows where a business district may once have stood. A single foundation catches the warm light. Nearby, an old tree shades the edge of the road. You imagine the sounds returning. A school bell, a wagon, conversation outside a store, music drifting from an evening gathering. For a moment, the empty land becomes crowded again. Then the prairie grows quiet. These towns remind you that forgotten places were sometimes created deliberately as answers to difficult questions. Where can you own land? Where can your children attend school? Where can you build a business? Where can you shape local life rather than merely endure decisions made by others? The answers were never simple. Some communities prospered, some struggled, some disappeared, but each represented an attempt to create belonging through geography. As the last light fades, you continue southwest. The prairie grows drier. Grass gives way to harder ground. Streams become less dependable. Soon every settlement you encounter will face another question just as fundamental. Where does the water come from? Ahead, across the American Southwest, abandoned canals, wells, farms, and adobe walls wait beneath a sky where survival often depended on one uncertain resource. Section 12. You leave the prairie behind and to continue southwest where the air becomes drier and the distances seem to widen again. The colors change first. Green gives way to pale grasses, red earth, dusty tan, and long bands of stone. Mountains rise sharply from open valleys. The sky seems brighter here, almost polished by the lack of moisture. Water becomes easier to notice because there is less of it. A narrow river catches the sunlight. As spring darkens one patch of ground, cottonwoods gather wherever their roots can reach dependable moisture. I begin to understand that in this landscape a settlement is often a map of water. Homes appear near rivers. Fields follow irrigation ditches. Trails bend towards springs. A well can determine where a family builds its house. Across the American Southwest, communities have survived for centuries by learning how to capture, guide, store, and share water. Long before modern dams and pipelines, indigenous peoples developed complex irrigation systems in arid regions. Later settlers, ranchers, miners, and farming communities adapted older ideas or constructed their own ditches, wells, canals, tanks, and cisterns. You follow one narrow channel through dry ground. It does not look impressive, only a shallow ditch. Yet water moves through it with quiet purpose. In parts of New Mexico and the wider Southwest, community irrigation ditches, known as acequias, became central to agricultural life. The word came through Spanish traditions, but the practice developed locally through generations of cooperation, adaptation, and shared rules. You walk beside one in early spring. The ditch has been cleared of branches and winter debris. Several neighbors work nearby with shovels. Before planting begins, the channel must be ready. Everyone depends on the same moving water that creates both cooperation and tension. If one farmer takes too much, another may receive too little. If the ditch breaks upstream, fields farther down can dry. Water is not merely a natural resource here. It is a social relationship. You reach a small settlement built around such a system. Adobe walls glow warmly beneath the afternoon sun. Flat roofs sit beneath wooden beams. A few courtyards provide shade. The architecture seems almost grown from the earth because much of it is made from earth. Adobe bricks are formed from mixtures of soil, water, and often straw or other fibrous material then dried in the sun. The walls can become thick. During hot days, they sow the movement of heat into interior rooms. At night, when the desert cools quickly, they release warmth more gradually. You step through a doorway. The change in temperature is immediate. Outside, sunlight presses against the ground. Inside, the air feels dim and cool. The room smells faintly of clay smoke, dried herbs, and wood. A small window admits a narrow rectangle of light. The walls themselves help make the climate livable. But adobe has a weakness. Water can damage it. That sounds almost ironic in a region where water is so precious. Heavy rain erodes exposed surfaces, so walls require maintenance. Fresh layers of protective mud plaster may need to be applied repeatedly. A house survives not because its walls are permanent. It survives because people keep repairing them. You imagine a family working together after the rainy season. Cracks are filled. Edges are smoothed. The walls look new again. Without that care, an abandoned adobe structure can slowly soften back into the ground. This is one reason some forgotten southwestern settlements seem to disappear so completely. Wooden beams may remain for a while. Stone foundations last longer, but earthen walls can collapse into low mounds that resemble the surrounding soil. The architecture returns to its original material. You continue beyond the houses toward an abandoned farm. Rows are still faintly visible. A few fruit trees stand near a dry channel. The irrigation gate is broken. Without water, the geometry of agriculture loses its meaning. You can imagine the farm when the ditch was flowing. Corn leaves rustled in the afternoon wind. Beans climbed supports. Chill peppers dried in the sun. Fruit repened beside the house. Animals waited near a trough. Then something changed. Perhaps the spring weakened. Perhaps the river shifted. Perhaps drought lasted too long. Perhaps a legal dispute redirected water elsewhere. Perhaps a mine or growing town demanded more. Abandonment rarely has only one cause. That uncertainty matters in arid landscapes because environmental and human pressures are closely connected. A settlement may decline during drought, but drought alone may not explain why families leave. Debt matters, transportation matters, land ownership matters, access to markets matters, politics over water matters. You can sometimes identify when a place was abandoned more easily than why. You follow the dry ditch until it reaches a stone-lined well. The opening is narrow and dark. A bucket once descended here on rope. You imagine the daily routine. Lower the bucket. Wait for the splash. Pull carefully. Pour into a jar or trough. Repeat. Water is heavy. Before household plumbing, simply obtaining enough for drinking, cooking, washing animals and gardens could require enormous labor. A family does not waste what took effort to lift from the earth. Even washing water may be reused. A basin used for cleaning might later water plants. Containers are covered to reduce evaporation. Shade matters. Timing matters. Tasks are organized around temperature. I begin to notice how climate shapes ordinary behavior more deeply than dramatic survival stories suggest. People rest during the hottest hours. Work begins earlier. Food is stored where temperatures remain lower. Doors and windows are positioned to use airflow. Courtyards create protected outdoor spaces. The settlement is a collection of small adjustments. Farther south, you encounter another water solution, a cistern. Rain falling from a roof can be directed into storage rather than allowed to disappear into dry soil. Where rainfall is irregular, one storm can provide water that must last for weeks. You stand beside a stone or plastered tank and hear the imagined sound of summer rain hitting a roof. For a few minutes, the entire settlement changes. Dust darkens. The smell of wet earth rises suddenly. Water runs through channels. Children may rush outside. Containers are positioned wherever they can catch more. The storm passes quickly. Sunlight returns, but the stored water remains. This is one of the unusual truths of desert life. A brief rain can influence daily routines long after the clouds are gone. You continue toward the ruins of a settlement established during a mining boom. Its streets are wider than those of the farming village. A few stone walls remain. Rusting metal lies near a collapsed structure. The mine once promised enough wealth to justify building in a place where almost everything had to be brought from somewhere else. Food, lumber, machinery, sometimes even drinking water. Boom towns in arid regions could grow before anyone knew whether the local water supply could support them permanently. A promising mineral discovery drew people quickly. Wells were dug. Water was hauled by wagon. Tanks were built. Then the ore declined. The cost of pumping increased. A better mine opened elsewhere. The population vanished. You walk down the abandoned street. Wind moves dust through doorways. A broken bottle catches the light. Inside one ruined building, a small metal washer basin remains. It seems almost insignificant. Yet here, where water was precious, the basin represents an entire chain of effort. Someone filled it. Someone washed. Someone probably used the water again for another purpose. Objects become more meaningful when resources are scarce. You continue beyond the mining camp toward a ranch. A windmill rises above the plain. Its metal wheel turns slowly. This simple machine transformed many dry landscapes by using wind to pump groundwater for people and livestock. You hear the blades clicking as they rotate. Below water enters a tank. Cattle gather nearby. The windmill makes permanent occupation possible where surface water is absent. It is both ordinary and remarkable. A moving circle in the sky brings water upward from darkness. But wells can fail too. Groundwater levels change. Pumps break. Aquifers can be depleted. A ranch established around one dependable well becomes vulnerable when that well no longer provides enough. Again, geography and technology shape settlement. I begin seeing abandoned water infrastructure everywhere. A dry stock tank, a collapsed well house, fragments of clay pipe, an irrigation gate rusted open, a ditch almost erased by wind. These are not simply utilities. They are the skeleton of the community. Follow the water system and you often find the settlement. Historians and archaeologists sometimes use old irrigation features to reconstruct how land was organized, but exact dates can be difficult to establish. A ditch may have been widened many times. One generation may have reused a channel dug by another. Maps can record major canals while ignoring small household diversions. The water moved continuously. The documentary record did not. You stand beside a dry channel as evening approaches. The desert cools surprisingly quickly. Blue shadows stretch from adobe walls. The scent of creosote and warm dust begins to soften in the night air. Far away, a windmill turns once more. You look toward the abandoned settlement and imagine water returning. The ditch fills. A garden becomes green. Someone washes vegetables near a doorway. A child carries a clay jar carefully with both hands. For a moment, the town feels alive again. Then the channel is dry. You continue west along a road once traveled by traders, ranchers, indigenous families, soldiers, settlers, and travelers. Ahead, a low building appears beside a crossroads. Bundles are stacked near the entrance. A few horses stand in the shade. This is not quite a town, not quite a store. It is a meeting point between worlds. The old trading posts are waiting ahead. Section 13. You leave the dry irrigation channel behind and continue along the old road where the desert begins to feel less empty than it first appeared. A trail approaches from the north. Another comes from a distant valley. A third seems to follow the river. People traveling through this country did not move randomly. They followed water mountain passes, known camps, seasonal routes, and places where supplies could be found. Eventually, several of those routes meet. At the crossroads stands a low building. Its walls are thick. Bundles hang beneath the shaded porch. A wagon rests nearby and horses shift lazily beside a rail. You have reached a trading post. Across the American West and Southwest trading posts occupied unusual positions between communities. Some served ranchers and settlers. Others developed around exchanges with native peoples whose trade networks had existed long before American expansion reached the region. A trading post might be tiny. One room could hold nearly everything, yet its influence could stretch across hundreds of miles. You step inside. The sudden shade feels pleasant after the bright road. The room smells of leather, wool, coffee, dust, tobacco, grain, and wooden shelving. Sacks sit against one wall. Blankets are folded on the shelves. Metal tools hang behind a counter. There may be flour, sugar, salt, canned goods, cloth needles, rope, ammunition, saddles, cookware, and small household items difficult to obtain in isolated places. But merchandise is only part of what moves through this room. Information moves too. Someone asks about water farther south. A traveler wants to know whether a road remains passable. A rancher has heard that cattle prices are changing. A family waits for mail. Someone carries news from a town several days away. For communities without telephones, reliable roads, or nearby newspapers, a trading post could become one of the best places to learn what was happening beyond the horizon. You linger near the counter. Nothing here is hurried. A transaction may involve conversation before money appears. In some regions, barter remained important alongside cash. Wool might be exchanged for food. Livestock products might be traded for manufactured goods. Craftwork could be sold or credited against household purchases. The exact arrangements differed greatly from one trading post to another. That difference matters. It is easy to imagine the trading post as one fixed institution, but each place depended on the people who used it, the economy around it, and the relationships built over time. In parts of the Southwest, trading posts became especially associated with commerce between Navajo communities and non-native merchants during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You imagine wool arriving in large sacks. Sheep were central to many Navajo households, providing meat, wool, and material for weaving. A trader might purchase raw wool or finished blankets and rugs, then send them onward toward distant markets. Manufactured goods traveled in the opposite direction. The building became a small hinge between local production and a much larger commercial world. You notice a woven rug folded carefully on a shelf. Its presence tells a complicated story. Weaving traditions existed long before tourists began purchasing Southwestern textiles. Yet outside demand increasingly influenced design sizes, colors, and the kinds of objects traders believed would sell. Some traders encouraged particular styles. Customers elsewhere developed expectations. Local artists responded in individual ways. Tradition and commerce began affecting one another. Historians can document many of these changes, but it is often difficult to know exactly why one weaver chose a particular pattern or altered a design. Perhaps family tradition mattered most. Perhaps available wool did. Perhaps a trader made a suggestion. Perhaps the maker simply preferred it. An object can survive without preserving the private thought that created it. You move farther into the room. Behind the counter lies a thick ledger. Credit became another important part of trading post life. In remote areas, cash could be so scarce or seasonal. A household might purchase supplies on credit and settle the account later after wool, livestock, crops, or the wages became available. The trader wrote everything down: flour, coffee, cloth, tools. A small debt could remain in the book for months. These ledgers now offer historians extraordinary glimpses of ordinary consumption, but they must be read carefully. A purchase tells you that something entered a household. It does not necessarily tell you who used it, why it was needed, or whether the customer considered the price fair. Numbers preserve one side of a relationship. Memory preserves another. You walk outside again. A bench sits beneath the porch. Several travelers rest there. One person has come from a ranch. Another has crossed the desert with goods for exchange. A native family has arrived from a community far beyond the nearest formal town. A postal rider may appear later. The trading post is not neutral ground in every historical sense, but it is certainly a meeting place. Languages overlap. Customs differ. People learn how to communicate through repeated contact. Sometimes translation is necessary. Sometimes long familiarity makes words less important. A gesture toward a sack of grain can explain quite a lot. So can a carefully written number. You notice a small bell near the doorway. Perhaps it once announced customers, or perhaps it served another purpose entirely. No surviving account explains it. These small uncertainties appear constantly in forgotten places. A historian can reconstruct the building. A photograph can reveal shelves. An inventory can list merchandise. But why a particular hook was attached to one beam may remain unknowable. Not every object carries a grand secret. Sometimes it simply survives after its explanation has disappeared. You continue around the building and discover a corral behind it. Animals need water and rest. Travelers do too. Some trading posts therefore grew into larger stopping places with barns, sleeping rooms, workshops, or places where meals could be prepared. A blacksmith might work nearby. A wagon could be repaired. A horse could be reshod. A traveller might wait several days for another party before continuing across difficult country. The post becomes more than a store. It becomes a pause in the landscape. You can understand its importance by imagining the alternative. Suppose the next town is 70 miles away. Your wagon wheel is cracked. You are running low on flour. A storm damaged parts of your harness. Suddenly, one isolated building beside the road feels like civilization itself. You enter the workshop. Metal rings softly beneath a hammer. The smell of heated iron mixes with dust and animal sweat. A repaired buckle may be worth more to a traveller than any decorative object in the store. Practical things keep journeys moving. That is another quiet fact repeated throughout your journey. History depends heavily on people who fix ordinary problems. The merchant records goods. The blacksmith repairs metal. Someone pumps water. Someone feeds horses. Someone sorts mail. None of these tasks seems remarkable in isolation. Together, they keep an enormous region connected. You follow a path toward the water source behind the post. Perhaps it is a well. Perhaps a spring. Perhaps a tank filled by windmill. Without dependable water, the trading post could not remain here for long. The lesson from the desert settlement behind you returns again.
Even commercial geography follows what a...
The road may explain why travelers pass. Water explains why they stop. As decades pass, the trading post changes. A better road arrives. Then automobiles. A fuel pump may appear outside. Mail service becomes more regular. Pack animals become less common. Some posts adapt and remain important community businesses. Others lose traffic when highways bypass them. A new town grows near a junction 20 miles away. The old road becomes quieter. You imagine the owner standing in the doorway one evening and listening. Years ago, wagons arrived constantly. Now perhaps only one vehicle has passed all afternoon. Dust settles on the porch. The road is still there. Its importance has moved elsewhere. Some abandoned trading posts survive as low ruins. Others became museum homes or businesses serving travelers. A few disappeared almost completely. The most fragile parts were often wooden additions, coral sheds, and shade structures. Stone or adobe walls might remain longer. Again, abandonment changes architecture unevenly. You walk through the remains of one forgotten post. The roof is gone. Sunlight falls directly onto the floor. A niche remains in one wall where goods may once have been stored. Near the entrance, a worn stone suggests thousands of footsteps. You pause there. That wear feels more intimate than a monument. No plaque is necessary. People cross this threshold repeatedly. They arrive needing something. Food, news, credit, a tool, directions, conversation, perhaps simply another human voice after several days on the road. The late afternoon grows cooler. Wind moves across the open country. You imagine the trading post alive one last time. A wagon approaches slowly. A dog lifts its head beneath the porch. Someone inside weighs coffee on a scale. A traveller unfolds a letter. Two people discuss weather beyond the next ridge. Nothing important seems to be happening, yet this is exactly how distant regions remained connected. Ordinary exchanges made geography manageable. As dusk gathers, you return to the road. Ahead, the route bends toward a thin line of steel crossing the desert. Beside it stands a water tower, then a depot, then several small buildings arranged around tracks that once carried almost every visitor into town. These places had even less independence than the settlements you have already seen. They existed because trains stopped there, and when the trains no longer stopped, sometimes only the name remained. Section 14. You leave the trading post behind and continue toward the faint gleam of steel crossing the desert floor. The tracks appear before the town does. Two parallel lines run toward the horizon, perfectly narrow beneath an enormous sky. Gravel crunches under your steps. Telegraph poles stand nearby, their wires humming softly when the wind is right. Then a water tower rises ahead. Beyond it, a depot. A few houses gather around the tracks as though the railway has pulled them into existence. In many parts of the American West, that is almost exactly what happened. Railroad companies needed places where trains could stop for water, fuel freight, mail repairs, passengers, or changes of crew. Some stops grew into thriving towns, others remained little more than a depot, a section house, a store, and several families. Their survival depended on one simple question: would the trains continue stopping? You walk toward the station. The depot is modest, built of wood and painted in a colour faded by years of sun. A broad roof projects over the platform, creating a band of shade. Benches sit near the wall. Inside, a ticket window separates the waiting room from the station office. A clock hangs where everyone can see it. Time matters here in a way it did not on the old wagon roads. Railroads required schedules. A stagecoach could be delayed by mud or a tired horse, but railway systems increasingly depended on coordinated time. Trains moving along the same tracks had to know where other trains were supposed to be. The arrival of railroad time changed daily habits in many communities. You imagine living beside this station. Morning begins not only with sunrise but with the first scheduled train. People learn that the eastbound passenger service arrives shortly after breakfast. The freight train comes later. Mail follows the timetable. A farmer planning a trip no longer simply leaves when the weather feels right, and leaves when the train does. You hear a distant whistle. The station agent steps outside. A few passengers rise from the bench. Children move closer to the edge of the platform until an adult quietly pulls them back. The locomotive appears through heat shimmering above the rails. Smoke drifts behind it. The ground begins to tremble. For a few minutes, the sleepy station becomes the busiest place in town. Mail sacks are unloaded. Crates move from a baggage car. Someone steps down carrying a suitcase. Another traveller climbs aboard. A newspaper arrives from a city hundreds of miles away. Then the conductor signals. The train departs. Almost immediately, this rhythm creates the town. A hotel may appear near the depot because travellers need rooms. A cafe serves meals between trains. A livery stable waits for passengers continuing by horse or wagon. Warehouses rise beside sidings where grain, livestock, timber ore, or other goods can be loaded. A small settlement becomes a transportation machine built around scheduled arrivals. You walk toward the water tower. Steam locomotives require enormous quantities of water. For this reason, water stations became essential along many early railway routes, especially across dry western country. A locomotive might stop simply because its tender needed refilling. That practical necessity could support a town. You stand beneath the tower and look upward. The wooden tank seems oversized compared with the surrounding buildings. A pipe extends toward the track. When a locomotive stops below water, rushes downward under gravity. The process lasts only minutes, but without it, the train cannot continue indefinitely. The town exists partly because steam needs water. This is one of the strangest foundations for a community you have encountered. Not gold, not fertile soil, not a harbour, a machine's thirst. You continue towards several small houses beside the tracks. Railroad employees often lived close to the line. Section crews maintained assigned stretches of track, inspecting rails, replacing ties, clearing debris, repairing switches and watching for damage. The work was constant. Heat-warped metal. Floods washed out embankments. Snowblock passes. Loose spikes needed attention. Tracks that looked permanent were actually the result of endless maintenance. You imagine a section worker leaving home before sunrise. He carries tools toward a handcar. The morning air is cold. His job is not to drive trains. It is to make sure trains can pass safely after he is gone. Names of such workers rarely enter broad histories, yet thousands of journeys depend upon them. Near the depot you find another small building. Perhaps it was a telegraph office. Before radio and modern communication systems, telegraph lines, allowed stations to exchange information much faster than trains themselves could travel. Messages clicked along wires. Orders could be sent ahead. Delays reported. Freight instructions changed. A station agent might serve as ticket seller, telegraph operator, freight clerk, local information source, and unofficial keeper of countless practical details. You step into the office. A desk stands near the window. Paper forms are stacked neatly. The telegraph key rests beneath a lamp. The room smells of ink, wood, dust, and warm metal. You hear the imagined tapping. Short.
No.
Short again. Information travels invisibly down the line. For remote towns, this feels almost miraculous. News no longer needs to arrive inside a saddlebag. It can arrive as electricity. Outside, another layer of railway life waits beside the platform. The mail. Railroads transformed postal service by moving letters and newspapers much faster across long distances. In some periods, mail was even sorted aboard specialized railway postal cars while trains moved between cities. You picture letters being separated into bags by destination. One sack is dropped at your small station. Inside may be a birthday letter, a bill, a catalogue, a government notice. Newspaper subscription. A message from a relative thousands of miles away. The arrival of one canvas mailbag could change several households at once. That is why people watch the depot. It connects private lives to the wider country. But technology does not stand still. Steam locomotives eventually give way to diesel power. The new engines do not need water towers every few dozen miles. Suddenly, one reason for stopping disappears. You look again at the large tank. For decades, it justified the station's existence. Now trains pass without needing it. Other changes follow. Improved locomotives travel farther between service stops. Centralized signaling reduces the need for some local employees. Highways allow passengers and freight to move by truck or automobile. Rail companies consolidate stations. A small depot may lose passenger service. Later, freight service ends too. The process feels familiar now. First, fewer trains stop. Then fewer people wait on the platform. The cafe closes early. The hotel rents fewer rooms. A warehouse stands empty. The station agent is transferred. Eventually, the timetable no longer includes the town. You imagine hearing the first train that does not stop. It approaches exactly as before. The whistle sounds. People inside the town can see the cars passing. But the locomotive never slows. For a place built around arrival, being passed by becomes a kind of disappearance. Some railway towns survived because agriculture, industry, or highways gave them other reasons to exist. Others did not. A few shrank to only several houses. Some lost every commercial building. Their names remained on railroad documents long after almost nothing stood beside the tracks. This creates another historical puzzle. What exactly qualifies as a town? Was a station with a depot, section house, water tower, and store a town? What if only 12 people lived there? What if a street plan existed but no streets were ever built? Maps often preserve names more confidently than landscapes do. You may find a place labelled clearly on a railway timetable and discover almost nothing on the ground. Perhaps the buildings were moved. Wooden depots could be relocated when companies changed operations. A station house might be loaded onto rail cars and transferred to another community. Once again, architecture travels while geography is forgotten. You walk along the platform after the final scheduled service has ended. Dust gathers near the ticket window. The clock has stopped. A poster curls away from the wall. Outside, weeds grow between the rails of an unused siding. Yet the main line remains active. A modern freight train passes at speed. Its sound is deeper than the old steam locomotive you imagined. It barely acknowledges the town. For several seconds, metal thunder fills the air. Then it disappears westward. The silence afterward feels enormous. You continue walking beside the tracks as evening settles over the desert. The water tower becomes a dark shape against the sky. Far behind you, the depot grows smaller. Ahead, the rails lead toward mountains, where another kind of temporary community once appeared almost overnight. There, rumors of silver, gold, copper, and other minerals drew thousands of people into narrow valleys and high desert basins. Hotels rose, saloons opened, assay offices measured ore, cabins climbed hillsides. Then the veins weakened, prices changed, and the crowds moved on. The mining camps are waiting beyond the next ridge. Section 50, you follow the railway into higher country where the land becomes rougher, and the settlements seem to cling to places no town would choose without a reason. The reason soon appears in the hills. Old mine openings cut into slopes. Waste rock forms pale heaps beside them. A rusting piece of machinery stands near a dry wash half hidden by sagebrush. Then you see the town, or what remains of it. A hotel with missing windows, several wooden cabins, the stone walls of an assay office, a collapsed shed where tools once hung from nails. Mining camps across the American West often began with remarkable speed. A prospector found promising ore. Word spread. Claims were filed. Merchants arrived. Within months, a quiet valley could become crowded with tents, cabins, wagons, animals, machinery, and people searching for opportunity. The settlement seemed to appear from the ground as quickly as the mineral that created it. You walk down the main street during its busiest years. Dust rises beneath boots and wagon wheels. A blacksmith works beneath an awning. A boarding house serves meals to men who have been underground since before sunrise. A small store sells candles, boots, beans, coffee, tools, clothing, and anything else people need in a place far from established towns. Near the centre stands the assay office. This is where hope becomes numbers. Miners bring pieces of ore to be tested so someone can estimate how much valuable metal they contain. A rock that looks promising may prove almost worthless. Another dull piece may contain enough silver or gold to justify weeks of work. The assayer therefore occupies a strangely powerful position. You enter the small office. Shelves hold labelled samples. A scale rests on a tibble. Tools are arranged carefully. The air smells faintly of dust-heated metal chemicals and wood smoke. Outside rumours travel faster than accurate information. Someone has struck a rich vein. A new claim is producing extraordinary ore. A mine farther up the canyon is hiring. Most stories grow slightly larger each time they are repeated. That uncertainty is part of the mining camp's atmosphere. Even people living there may not know whether the town is becoming permanent or simply passing through one fortunate season. You continue toward the cabins. Many are simple. Boards shrink in dry weather and swell during storms. Newspaper cloth or other material may be used to block drafts through cracks. Winter in high mining country can be severe. Snow collects against walls. Water freezes. Wood must be cut or purchased. A cabin that seems adequate in summer feels very different in January. You step inside one after dark. A small stove warms the room. Boots dry beside it. A bunk occupies one wall. A candle burns on a rough table. The room smells of wool, smoke, leather, and damp earth carried home from the mine. Few possessions are visible. Some workers expect to leave soon. That expectation shapes the town. People who believe they will become wealthy quickly do not always build as if they plan to remain for 50 years. Yet many stay much longer than intended. A temporary cabin acquires a porch. A garden appears. Someone plants a tree. Families arrive. Children begin attending school. The camp slowly develops ordinary routines beneath its extraordinary reputation. You walk toward a boarding house. Inside a long table is being set. Meals are practical and filling. Beans, bread, potatoes, meat when available. Coffee almost always seems welcome. Miners working long shifts require enormous amounts of food, and boarding house cooks become essential members of the community. You imagine one woman rising before most of the town. She lights the stove while the street is still dark. Dough is prepared. Coffee is boiled. Breakfast must be ready before the first shift leaves. By the time the miners finish eating, she's already thinking about the next meal. Her work rarely appears in stories about mining fortunes. But without it, the mine operates less efficiently. Again, the hidden history lies in maintenance. Someone washes clothing. Someone carries water. Someone keeps records. Someone repairs boots. Someone cooks. Someone tends animals. A boomtown depends on people doing ordinary tasks while everyone talks about extraordinary wealth. You continue uphill toward the mine entrance. Cool air comes from the tunnel. Inside light becomes precious. Candles and later specialized lamps help workers see underground, but illumination is always limited. You do not follow them far. Tonight you remain close to the entrance where ore carts emerge into daylight and loaded rock is sorted or transported toward mills. The machinery has its own rhythm. Metal wheels strike rails. Timber supports creak. A steam engine works nearby. Water runs through processing equipment. The landscape begins to sound mechanical. Mining does not end when rock leaves the tunnel. Ore must be crushed, concentrated, transported, and processed. So mills appear near mines. Roads improve. Rail spurs arrive. Water systems are built. A settlement becomes more complicated as investment grows. This can create the illusion of permanence. A substantial hotel opens. Brick replaces wood in a few buildings. A bank appears. A newspaper prints confident predictions. Lots become expensive. Perhaps a theatre opens. You stand outside it on a Saturday evening. Music drifts through the doorway. People who spent the week in dust and noise have dressed carefully. For a few hours, the mining camp tries to look like a city. Then the ore changes. Sometimes the richest deposits are exhausted first. Deeper mining requires more equipment and money. Water enters tunnels. Processing becomes expensive. Metal prices fall. Investors lose interest. One mine closes. Another reduces its workforce. The shift can be gradual, or astonishingly fast. You walk the same main street 2 years later. The hotel has empty rooms. A storekeeper offers discounts because fewer customers remain. The newspaper appears only once a week. A family loads furniture onto a wagon. Someone removes doors and windows from a building before leaving because useful lumber is too valuable to abandon. This is one reason mining ghost towns can look so incomplete. People often salvaged them. Stoves were taken, timber removed, roofing reused, windows transported to another settlement. Sometimes entire buildings were more. A boom town could physically shrink as its architecture migrated elsewhere. The word ghost town suggests that everything was simply left behind. Often people took as much as they could carry. You continue toward an abandoned hotel. Only the lower stone walls remain. From photographs, historians may know that it once had 2 stories and a balcony. But photographs themselves can mislead. A busy street captured during a celebration may make a small town appear larger than usual. Promotional accounts exaggerate populations. Newspapers compete to describe prosperity. Later memories may exaggerate decline in the opposite direction. How many people truly lived here at the height of the boom? Sometimes the answer is surprisingly uncertain. Population estimates for Western camps often vary widely. Some residents stayed only weeks. Others lived outside formal town boundaries. Transient workers were difficult to count. The mining camp itself was constantly moving socially even when its buildings remained fixed. You notice another strange remnant beyond the hotel. A row of empty bottles lies partly buried behind what was once a saloon or boarding house. Archaeologists sometimes learn a great deal from refuse. Broken dishes reveal household patterns. Cans reveal food. Bottle fragments hint at medicine, alcohol, or commercial products. Animal bones suggest what people ate. Trash becomes evidence because people rarely expected anyone to study it. You kneel beside a ceramic fragment. Perhaps it came from an inexpensive plate. Perhaps someone carried that plate across hundreds of miles before it broke here. No written record mentions it. Yet the object survived longer than its owner. The sun begins dropping toward the ridge. Warm light reaches the upper windows of the few buildings still standing. A breeze moves through loose boards. Somewhere sheet metal taps softly against a wall. You continue beyond the main street toward the cemetery. Mining cemeteries can reveal how international these settlements became. Names may reflect origins in Ireland, Cornwall, Italy, China, Mexico, Germany, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and many other places. Mining drew labor across borders and oceans. One isolated mountain camp could contain languages from half the world. The popular image of the Western mining town often simplifies this diversity. The grave markers quietly correct it. You pass names carved into the stone and wood. Some inscriptions are elaborate, others are simple. A few markers have disappeared entirely. Again, historians face uncertainty. Not every burial was recorded carefully. Wooden markers decayed. Cemeteries moved. Later mining activity disturbed older sites. The visible graves may represent only part of the community that once lived here. You walk back towards town as darkness settles. Now you imagine the final residents, not the first prospectors, not the wealthiest mine owners. The last shopkeeper, the final family with a child still attending school, the caretaker who watches empty buildings, the person who remains because leaving costs money too. Ghost towns do not become ghosts on one particular day. They thin. A building darkens, a door stays closed, a chimney stops smoking. Eventually the wind has more space than the people. You pause at the center of the abandoned street. The sky above the mountains is deep blue now. For a moment you hear the old town beneath the silence. A hammer from the blacksmith shop. Plates in the boarding house. An ore cart rattling downhill. Someone laughing behind a hotel door. Then only the breeze remains. You continue west. The mining road descends toward a different landscape where mountains meet the Pacific and fog gathers above cliffs. Ahead lie forgotten places along the California coast. Old ranch settlements, small ports, industrial villages, military outposts, communities that once seemed important before larger cities, new roads, and changing economies drew attention elsewhere. The ocean is waiting beyond the hills. Section 60. You leave the mining country behind and follow the road west until the air begins to change. The first sign is not the ocean itself, it is the fog. A pale layer gathers over the hills and moves slowly through stands of coastal trees. The sunlight softens, dry inland colors give way to deeper greens, grey cliffs, weathered timber, and the dark blue of distant water. Then the Pacific appears. It stretches beyond the horizon, restless, but strangely quiet from this height. Along the California coast, famous cities eventually became symbols of growth, wealth, and movement. Yet between them were many smaller places that served ranches, fisheries, military stations, logging operations, quarries, factories, and isolated harbors. Some remained important for only a few decades. Others survived, but their original purpose disappeared. You descend toward a small cove. A wooden pier reaches into the water. Several buildings stand close to shore, protected by a low bluff. Nets dry on poles. Barrels sit beside a shed. A road climbs inland toward ranch country. This little settlement exists because ships can stop here. Before dependable highways connected much of coastal California, the ocean itself functioned as a transportation route. Small ports allowed agricultural products, lumber, hide, stone, and other goods to reach larger markets without first crossing difficult terrain. You imagine a schooner approaching the cove. Workers gather near the landing. A boat carries cargo between the vessel and shore if the water is too shallow for the larger ship. Crates move hand to hand. Rope tightens. Wooden planks creak. The smell of salt mixes with tarfish, damp wood, and seaweed drying in the sun. For a few hours, the quiet cove becomes busy. Then the ship leaves. The settlement returns to gulls and waves. Some California coastal communities grew around ranching. Long before modern subdivisions and highways covered parts of the coast, vast ranch properties extended across hills and valleys. Cattle grazed on open land. Horses moved between scattered buildings. Workers repaired fences, managed livestock, maintained equipment, and traveled long distances between neighboring settlements. You follow an inland track toward one such ranch. The buildings are grouped around a protected area away from the strongest ocean wind. A large barn stands nearby. There are coral storage sheds and a simple house with a veranda. Eucalyptus trees may have been planted later as windbreaks, while older native vegetation survives along slopes and creeks. You enter the kitchen. The room is warmer than the foggy morning outside. Coffee simmers near the stove. Bread rests under a cloth. Leather tack hangs beyond the door, carrying the strong smell of horses and oil. Life here depends on distance. A broken tool cannot always be replaced quickly. A storm may delay deliveries, so repair becomes a routine skill. Metal is reshaped. Leather is stitched. Wooden handles are replaced. Nothing useful is discarded too quickly. You have noticed this pattern before. Forgotten places often teach people to maintain what they already have. Farther along the coast, you encounter another kind of settlement. This one grew around fishing. Small fishing communities could form near productive waters, protected coves, or seasonal runs of particular species. The harbour smells sharper here. Nets hang everywhere. Wooden boats rest above the tide line. A simple shed is used to clean and prepare the catch. Families may come from different parts of the world, bringing their own knowledge of boats, nets, preservation methods, and local waters. California's fishing history became remarkably diverse. Italian, Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese, Croatian, Scandinavian, and other immigrant communities contributed to coastal industries in different regions and periods. You imagine a morning before sunrise. Lanterns move towards the boats. The harbour is almost black. Fishermen speak quietly while checking ropes and gear. Someone listens to the water more than the conversation. Knowledge of the coast is practical and intimate, where currents change, where rocks lie beneath the surface. Which wind makes returning difficult? Which season brings particular fish closer to shore? Much of this knowledge is passed directly from one person to another, not written, not formally recorded. When a fishing community disappears, some of that local knowledge can disappear with it. You continue along a bluff until you find the remains of an industrial settlement. A chimney stands beside broken foundation. Rusting bolts protrude from concrete. The buildings once belonged to a processing plant, quarry mill, or other business tied to the resources of the coast. Industry sometimes chose surprisingly remote locations. A quarry needed valuable stone. A lumber operation needed access to forests. A factory might require water transportation or proximity to raw material. Workers followed. Housing followed the workers. A store followed the housing. Soon a community existed where almost nobody had planned to build one before. You walk among the foundations. The wind is stronger here. Fog beads against the grass. A section of rail remains partly buried beside the former industrial yard. Perhaps small locomotives or carts once moved material toward a pier. The line now ends in weeds. You try to reconstruct the sound. Machinery, metal wheels, shouted instructions, steam. Then you look at the empty ground. Silence has changed the scale of everything. A factory that once dominated the town now occupies only a few rectangles in the grass. The ocean continues exactly as before. Farther south, military installations created another collection of temporary communities along the California coast. Forts, batteries, observation posts, training grounds, and support buildings occupied strategic headlands and harbour entrances. Some later became obsolete as military technology changed. You climb toward one abandoned position overlooking the sea. Concrete structures sit low against the hillside. The architecture is very different from ranch buildings or fishing shacks. Thick walls, narrow openings, careful sightlines toward open water. Yet even military places depended on ordinary routines. Someone cooked meals, someone repaired uniforms, someone swept floors, someone checked lamps, someone carried mail. Someone complained about fog. You imagine a young serviceman standing here on a cold morning, not during any dramatic event, but simply waiting for breakfast. The Pacific below him disappears beneath grey mist. He can hear waves without seeing them. A gull lands on a railing. Days in such places could contain far more routine than excitement. When strategic priorities changed, many sites were reduced, transferred, abandoned, or repurposed. Buildings remained after the function disappeared. Nature moved in quickly. Ice plants spread over disturbed ground. Birds nested in unused structures. Rust formed on exposed metal. A place designed for constant readiness became strangely peaceful. You follow an old service road toward another forgotten settlement. This one once housed workers connected to a coastal railway. The line curved along cliffs, through tunnels, or beside beaches where engineering required constant attention. California's coastal geography is beautiful precisely because it is difficult. Cliffs collapse. Rain causes landslides. Streams flood. Salt corrodies metal. A transportation route beside the ocean requires continuous maintenance. When a railway or road was rerouted, the communities supporting the old route could lose their purpose. You see an abandoned tunnel entrance ahead. Vegetation partly covers the stonework. The track is gone. Inside, the darkness is cool and damp. You do not enter far. Instead, you stand at the mouth and imagine a locomotive emerging into sunlight decades earlier. Passengers look toward the ocean. Workers nearby know every weakness in the line. Which slope moves after heavy rain? Which culvert fills with debris? Which section of track needs extra inspection after a storm? Official maps show the railway. They rarely preserve that practical knowledge. Once again, the people who maintained a place knew it more intimately than the documents did. By afternoon, the fog lifts. You continue toward an old ranching village farther inland. Only a few structures survive. A schoolhouse has become storage. A former store is now private residence. The original road no longer carries through traffic. The settlement did not vanish dramatically. A highway simply passed elsewhere. The harbour became less important. Nearby cities offered jobs. Children moved away. One family sold land, another stayed. Decade after decade, the community changed until its earlier form became difficult to see. This creates an unusual kind of forgotten place. People may still live there. Buildings may still stand. But the old network of relationships has disappeared. A former general store becomes a house. A boarding room becomes a bedroom. A working pier becomes a fishing spot. The geography survives while the meaning changes. Historians sometimes struggle to define when such a place truly ended. Was it when the last commercial ship called? When the post office closed? When the school stopped operating? When the original families left? There may be no single date. Communities often disappear gradually enough that nobody witnesses a final moment. You walk toward the cemetery on a hill above the coast. The stones face the ocean. Some names belong to ranching families. Others belong to fishermen, labourers, merchants, and children. Dates overlap across generations. A few markers are damaged by weather. Salt air slowly softens inscription. Plants grow around the bases. From here you can see why people stayed. The view is extraordinary. Evening sunlight breaks beneath the clouds and turns the ocean pale gold. The roofs below seem tiny. The cliffs glow softly. You imagine the settlement a century earlier. Smoke rises from several chimneys. Someone walks from the pier carrying a coil of rope. A horse moves along the inland road. A child runs toward the school. Nothing famous happens. The day simply continues. Perhaps that is why these places are so easy to forget. They were built around work that became unnecessary. Their stories did not end with one grand event. They faded because transportation improved, industries relocated, land values changed, or younger people chose different lives. The physical remains can seem almost accidental. A chimney, a pier piling, a row of trees, a foundation beneath grass, a road that ends at a locked gate. You pause near the bluff as the temperature falls. The Pacific is darker now. Fog begins forming again offshore. Behind you, the old road disappears among eucalyptus and cypress. Ahead, your journey turns toward landscapes that seem even more untouched. Mountain valleys, forests, meadows, places now protected as national parks. Yet long before visitors arrived with trail maps and cameras, families lived there. They built cabins, planted orchards, raised children, cut hay, buried relatives, and walked roads that modern visitors may cross without noticing. You turn inland. The forgotten settlements inside America's national parks are waiting ahead. Section 17. You leave the California coast and turn inland following rivers toward higher ground where forests begin to close around the road. The air cools, pines rise above you, granite appears between roots, farther ahead mountains lift into pale morning light and the landscape begins to resemble the kind of place modern visitors describe as untouched. That word follows you for a while. Untouched. It sounds peaceful, yet it is rarely accurate. Many landscapes now protected as national parks were lived in, worked in, travelled through and carefully managed long before they became protected land. You enter one such valley. A meadow stretches beneath tall trees. A river moves quietly along one side. At first there seems to be nothing here except grass, water and stone. Then you notice a line of fruit trees. They are too evenly spaced to be wild. You walk closer. An old orchard. The trees are aged now, their branches twisted and irregular. Moss clings to bark, some still produce small apples each autumn. A house once stood nearby. You search the grass and find the foundation. Only stones remain. Someone planted these trees because they expected to harvest fruit year after year. That simple expectation changes the valley. It was not empty, it was home. Across lands that later became national parks, families built farms, ranches, mills, cabins, schools, churches, roads and small settlements. Some had lived there for generations, others arrived only briefly. And long before them, indigenous communities had used many of these landscapes for hunting, gathering, travel, ceremony, settlement and seasonal movement. The story of a protected landscape therefore does not begin when a park boundary is drawn. You continue toward an abandoned cabin. Its roof is gone. A stone chimney remains against one wall. The logs have darkened with age and grass now grows through the floor. You imagine the cabin when smoke rose from the chimney on a winter morning. A kettle warms near the fire. Boots dry by the wall. Someone shakes snow from a coat before stepping inside. The room is small, but from within it, surrounding mountains do not feel like scenery. They are weather, distance, work, food, firewood, routes to neighbors. People living in these valleys read the landscape in practical ways. A visitor may notice a beautiful meadow. A farmer notices whether hay will grow there. A rancher notices water. A hunter notices animal tracks. A family notices where snow remains longest and which slope receives afternoon sun. The same land carries many meanings at once. You walk toward a field that now looks almost completely natural. A faint stone wall crosses one edge. That wall changes everything. Once the meadow may have been fenced. Livestock grazed here. Hair was cut. Children crossed it on the way to a neighbor's home. If the field is abandoned long enough, young trees begin growing at the margins. Another generation passes. The former pasture becomes a forest. You have seen this process before in New England. Here it happens inside landscapes later celebrated for wilderness. The forest can make human history difficult to see. You continue eastward through the mountains and eventually arrive in the Great Smoky Mountains. Today, much of this landscape is covered by deep forest. Yet before the national park was established, thousands of people lived in the surrounding coves, hollows and valleys. You follow a narrow road toward a small homestead. A farmhouse stands beside a creek. Nearby are a barn, corn crib, smokehouse and springhouse. Nothing is large. Everything has a purpose. The barn shelters animals and hay. The corn crib allows air to circulate around stored corn. The smokehouse preserves meat. The springhouse uses cold water to keep food cool. A farm is not one building. It is a system. You walk between the structures and notice how close they stand to water fields and one another. Daily life would involve constant movement among them. Carry feed. Fetch water. Milk animals. Split wood. Repair a fence. Gather vegetables. Hang laundry. Check the garden. The distances are small because the tasks repeat endlessly. You enter the springhouse. The temperature drops. Temperature drops. Clear water moves through a channel beneath the structure. Butter, milk and other foods could be stored here before electric refrigeration. The same quiet technique you noticed in Appalachia appears again. Useful knowledge travels through generations without needing complicated machinery. Outside, you hear a faint hammer. You follow it toward a small mill beside moving water. Water-powered mills were once important landmarks in rural communities. Farmers brought grain to be ground. Neighbors met while waiting. News passed from one family to another. A mill was both a machine and a gathering place. The wheel turns slowly beside the creek. Water provides the power. Inside, flour dust settles lightly on wooden beams. The sound is steady rather than loud. Stone grinding against grain. Wooden gears moving. Water beneath everything. When a park is created, places like this may be preserved. Others disappear. That process can become complicated. Creating protected land often required acquiring private property. Some families sold willingly. Others felt deeply attached to homes they did not want to leave. In certain parks, residents were allowed to remain for part of their lives under special agreements. In others, relocation happened more quickly. The official goal might be conservation. The private experience could still be loss. You imagine an elderly resident preparing to leave a mountain house. The building is ordinary. That is what makes it difficult. The marks on the doorway show children's heights. A tree beside the house was planted after a wedding. The porch faces the valley because someone liked the evening view. A property document can describe acreage. It cannot describe these attachments. Historians know many dates connected with park creation, land purchase, and relocation, but they cannot always reconstruct exactly how every family felt. Memories differ. Some descendants speak proudly of the land being protected. Others remember displacement. Both can be true. You follow another road until it ends near a cemetery. The stones remain because burial grounds were often preserved even when nearby homes disappeared. Names repeat across generations. Flowers appear beside several graves. Some families continue returning long after they no longer live in the valley. A cemetery can keep a community connected to land after almost everything else has changed. You notice a path leading away from the graves. Perhaps it once went to a church. Only the foundation remains. You can reconstruct the building from the shape. A simple wooden structure. Windows along both sides. Benches inside. People arriving on foot, horseback, or wagon. On Sundays, the church may have been the busiest place in the valley. Now the forest presses close around the stones. The absence feels gentle rather than empty. You continue toward another national park landscape where an old ranch survives as scattered buildings. The structures are weathered by wind and snow. A shed leans slightly. Fencing disappears into tall grass. You notice something easy to overlook. Old irrigation channels. Even in landscapes that now appear entirely natural, earlier residents redirected water. A ditch may cross a meadow so subtly that hikers step over it without recognizing what it is. Yet that shallow line may have carried water to crops or hayfields for decades. Human history often survives as geometry. Straight lines, terraces, ditches, orchard spacing, foundation corners. Nature rarely arranges these things so deliberately. We begin seeing them everywhere. The landscape is becoming readable again, not because the forest changes, because you know what to notice. Another unusual clue appears beside the trail. Lilacs. They bloom near a place where no building stands. You have encountered this before too. Domestic plants can remain after houses vanish. Fruit trees, flowers, herbs, and garden plants sometimes preserve the memory of settlement long after wood has rotted away. You kneel beside the flowers. Someone chose them. Someone watered them. Someone enjoyed seeing them beside a doorway. The doorway is gone. The flowers still return. That small survival feels more intimate than a large ruin. You continue toward evening. Visitors pass occasionally on a modern trail. They admire mountains, wildlife, forests, and open meadows. Few notice the shallow cellar beside the path. Fewer recognize the old road disappearing into trees. A stone pile looks natural unless you know why it was built. This is how forgotten places can remain in plain sight. Not hidden behind locked doors, hidden by interpretation. You stop beside a quiet stream. The water reflects the last light between branches. Behind you lies a landscape that has been called wilderness, home, farm, hunting ground, workplace, park, and sanctuary at different times. None of those descriptions completely cancels the others. A place can become protected without becoming empty of history. You carry that thought farther west and across the Pacific. Ahead, another group of islands waits beneath warm rain and trade winds. Their villages changed as plantations, shipping, migration roads, and tourism reshaped daily life. Some communities grew, others faded. Old foundations disappeared beneath vegetation. Traditional paths became roads, and along the Hawaiian Islands, familiar landscapes slowly acquired entirely new meanings. Section 10. You leave the mountain valleys behind and cross the Pacific, where the air feels warmer and softer. The change is immediate. Trade winds move through palms and broad leaves. The scent of salt mixes with flowers, wet earth, and wood smoke. Rain passes quickly across distant ridges, leaving parts of the landscape shining beneath sunlight. The islands seem lush, but abundance here has always depended on careful knowledge. Water falls heavily in some places and remains scarce in others. Steep slopes rise from narrow coastal plains. Valleys open suddenly between volcanic ridges. The sea offers food and transportation, but it can also separate one community from another. You follow a path toward an older Hawaiian village. Long before, plantation towns and tourist roads transformed many coastal districts. Native Hawaiian communities organized daily life around relationships between mountain valley shoreline and sea. You notice this immediately. Nothing seems isolated. Water moving from upland forests feeds streams. Streams support taro fields. People gather plants from different elevations. Fishing grounds extend beyond the shore. A household may depend on resources spread across several environments. The landscape functions as one connected system. You descend toward a patchwork of wet fields. Water moves gently between stone-edge plots. Taro grows in the shallow flooded ground. You hear frogs and insects in the warm air. Bare feet move carefully along narrow embankments. Someone clears a small channel so water reaches the next field. The work appears quiet. It is also highly organized. Traditional Hawaiian agriculture included sophisticated irrigation systems in valleys where dependable streams made wetland taro cultivation possible. Water had to be directed without simply exhausting the stream. Channels required maintenance. Stone walls needed repair. Sediment had to be cleared. A blocked section could affect several families downstream. Once again, water creates community obligations. You recognize the pattern from the acequias of the southwest, even though the climate and culture are entirely different. Water must be shared. You follow the channel toward several houses. Traditional Hawaiian dwellings were often built from local materials such as wood grasses, leaves, and fiber. The structures breathe with the climate. Roofs are steep enough to shed tropical rain. Openings allow air to move. The smell inside is different from the adobe houses you visited in the desert. Here you notice dried grass, woven mats, smoke earth, and salt carried in from the coast. A mat covers part of the floor. Cordage hangs from a beam. Food is being prepared nearby. You hear the soft sound of pounding. Poi made from cooked taro became one of the central foods of Hawaiian life. The preparation required labor. Cooked taro was pounded and mixed with water until it reached the desired consistency. You watch the steady movement. Nothing is rushed. A repetitive task creates its own rhythm. Hands rise, hands fall. The sound is muted and regular. Food preparation becomes part of the soundscape of the village. You continue toward the shoreline. Canoes rest above the high water mark. Nets dry in the sun. A fisherman studies the sea before deciding whether to leave. Knowledge of currents, reefs, winds, seasons, and fish behavior could be as important here as knowledge of soil was to farmers inland. You look toward the horizon. To an outsider, the ocean seems open and featureless. To someone raised here, it contains roots. A subtle difference in watercolor may reveal depth. Bird movement may suggest fish. Clouds over distant land can help with orientation. A place that looks empty can be full of information. That becomes one of the quiet lessons of island history. Landscapes are readable only if you understand their language. You turn back inland and continue through time. The village changes. Ships arrive more frequently. Foreign goods enter local exchange. New diseases, religions, political systems, and commercial pressures reshape Hawaiian life. By the 19th century, large-scale agricultural enterprises increasingly transformed parts of the islands. Sugar becomes especially important. Later, pineapple does too. Plantations require land, water, labor, transportation. Entire communities develop around these needs. You enter one plantation settlement in the early 20th century. The architecture has changed. Rows of worker houses stand near fields extending toward the hills. A mill rises beyond them. Rail tracks or plantation roads connect fields to processing facilities. The town is organized around production. You have seen this structure before in the company towns of the mainland. But here the population is unusually diverse. Plantation owners and managers recruited workers from many parts of the world. People arrived from Japan, China, the Philippines, Portugal, Korea, Puerto Rico, and elsewhere. Native Hawaiians also worked within the changing economy. The result was a remarkable mixture of languages and traditions. You walk between the houses at the end of a workday. The air carries several cooking smells at once. Rice steams in one kitchen. Something is frying nearby. A family prepares soup. Another household preserves vegetables. Children move easily between homes. Words from different languages begin crossing boundaries. Food does the same. A dish from one community is tasted by another. Ingredients are substituted. Techniques are borrowed. Over time, local culture absorbs pieces from many sources. I begin to understand that plantation life did not simply bring separate immigrant traditions to Hawaii. It created new combinations. Even everyday speech changed. Workers who needed to communicate across language barriers contributed to the development of local forms of communication that evolved through generations. The exact pathways of language change can be complex, and historians and linguists continue examining how different communities influenced one another. But daily necessity certainly mattered. People had to work together, trade together, raise children beside one another. Communication adapted. You stop near a plantation store. Like the company store on the mainland, it provides necessities close to the workplace. But another building nearby interests you more. A communal bathhouse, gathering space, temple, church, or social hall might serve one part of the community. Religious and cultural institutions helped immigrants preserve familiar practices while adjusting to island life. You enter one small hall in the evening. Shoes gather near the entrance. Someone has brought food. Children sit together while adults talk. Work has ended, but community life continues. The plantation may organize the economy. Residents still organize themselves. That distinction returns again. Institutions can plan streets. They cannot entirely plan culture. You move farther through the 20th century. Roads improve. Trucks replace some plantation railways. Agricultural operations become more mechanized. Global markets change. Some plantations close. Worker camps shrink. Families move toward larger towns. A place built around sugar or pineapple begins losing the reason it was created. You walk along a former camp road years later. Grass grows where children once played. One house survives as a residence. Another has been moved. A concrete foundation remains beneath vines. Fruit trees still grow behind an empty lot. You recognize the pattern immediately. The old settlement survives in plants' boundaries and family memory, but Hawaii adds another layer. Tourism transforms certain coastal areas. Hotels rise where ranches, fishing villages, agricultural land, or small residential communities once occupied the shore. Roads are widened. Beaches become destinations. Old place names may survive while the everyday meaning of those places changes completely. You stand at a coastal overlook where visitors now watch sunset. The view is beautiful. That has not changed, but the landscape beneath the beauty has changed many times. A fishing area becomes a harbour. A ranch becomes housing. A plantation becomes a resort district. A village path becomes a paved road. The place remains geographically familiar while its social world is replaced. That makes forgetting unusually easy. Nothing appears abandoned. There are lights, cars, buildings, people everywhere. Yet an older community can disappear beneath the intense modern activity just as thoroughly as one can disappear beneath forest. You follow an old path away from the busiest coast. Behind vegetation, low stone walls remain. Perhaps they once bordered agricultural plots. Perhaps they marked a house site. Archaeologists can identify many features, but uncertainty remains around others. Tropical vegetation grows quickly. Wooden buildings decay. Later construction disturbs earlier layers. Oral traditions preserve locations that maps ignored, yet names and boundaries may shift over generations. The islands hold history densely. One place can contain many places. You continue toward a small cemetery above the sea. The stones reveal overlapping communities. Native Hawaiian names, Japanese names, Portuguese names, Filipino name. Families linked to plantations, ranches, fishing, and newer industries. The inscriptions turn a hillside into a quiet record of migration. You pause while trade winds move through the grass. Below, waves break against dark volcanic rock. The sound is steady. You imagine the older village returning. Taro fields fill the valley. A canoe approaches shore. Smoke rises from a cooking fire. Then the plantation settlement appears over it. Rows of houses, mill machinery, workers returning at dusk. Then modern roads cross the same ground. Each period leaves something behind. A stone wall, a recipe, a surname, a place name, a song, a tree planted beside a vanished house. The island remembers in layers. As evening settles over the Pacific, you turn north. Far beyond these warm shores lies a landscape almost impossibly different. Blue summer daylight, winter darkness, tundra, permafrost, cold coastal seas. Their settlements grew around mines, trading stations, military installations, fisheries, and distant transportation routes. Some lasted only a few seasons. Others endured for generations before shrinking into silence. The abandoned northern settlements of Alaska are waiting beneath a much colder sky. Section 19. You leave the warm Pacific behind and travel north until the light itself begins to behave differently. Summer evenings stretch almost endlessly. The sun lowers but seems reluctant to disappear. Shadows lengthen across tundra, then soften without ever becoming completely dark. In winter, the opposite is true. Daylight becomes brief and settlements glow beneath lamps while snow reflects every small source of light. You have reached Alaska. The distances here feel larger than anywhere you have traveled so far. Mountains divide valleys. Rivers have become highways. Coastal communities face open water for part of the year and ice for another. Roads connect only some places. For many settlements, ships, aircraft, sled routes, or riverboats have mattered more than highways. This geography created communities that could feel intensely isolated. Yet isolation did not mean emptiness. Long before mining camps, trading stations, military posts, or modern towns appeared, Alaska was home to indigenous peoples with sophisticated knowledge of coastlines, rivers, weather, animal migration, sea ice, and seasonal movement. I'll begin beside a cold northern shore. A cluster of buildings stands above the beach. Boats have been pulled onto the land. Driftwood lies in pale piles near the water. The wind carries the smell of salt, wet earth, fish, and smoke. For a coastal family, knowledge of weather is not optional. A clear morning can change quickly. Fog closes around the shoreline. Wind shifts. Ice moves. The sea becomes dangerous long before it looks dramatic from shore. You notice how carefully people watch it. A person preparing to travel may study clouds, currents, wind direction, and the condition of the ice before making a decision. That knowledge is built through experience. Much of it is local. A rule useful in one bay may not apply in another. Just as the ocean around Hawaii contained invisible routes, Alaska's water and ice contain information that outsiders may barely recognize. You continue inland along a river. For many communities, rivers functioned as transportation corridors through country where building roads was difficult and expensive. During warmer months, boats carried people and supplies. In winter, frozen waterways sometimes became routes for sleds and later snow machines. The same river changed purpose with the season. You stand on its bank in late summer. The water moves dark and steady beneath a pale sky. Several months from now, the surface may be locked beneath ice. Season determines geography. You follow the river toward an old trading settlement. A few log buildings stand close to the bank. One was once a store. Another may have served as a warehouse. Furs, food, tools, ammunition, cloth, tea, tobacco, and other goods moved through places like this as Russian and later American commercial networks expanded across Alaska. Trading posts often depended on existing indigenous travel routes and local knowledge. They were rarely built in truly random locations. A river junction, a coastal landing, a traditional meeting area, a place where people were already moving. You enter the old store. The floorboards are rough. A stove stands near the center. Shelves once held goods brought astonishing distances by ship, riverboat, or sled. You imagine opening a crate that has traveled from a southern port. Inside are objects ordinary elsewhere. Coffee, flour, metal tools, fabric. Here transportation turns ordinary goods into something more valuable. Distance adds weight to everything. A broken saw cannot simply be replaced tomorrow. A missing part may take weeks or months to arrive. Once again, repair becomes a way of life. You see patched clothing, repaired tools, wooden handles fitted to older metal heads, containers reused for purposes their manufacturers never imagined. Remote places develop their own quiet economy of usefulness. Nothing is discarded casually. You continue north toward a settlement created by mining. Gold discoveries drew prospectors into Alaska and the Yukon during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some towns expanded with startling speed. Tents appeared first, then wooden cabins. Stores followed. Hotels, warehouses, saloons, blacksmith shops, transport companies. The pattern resembles the western mining camps you visited earlier, but the climate changes everything. You enter one such settlement during winter. Snow presses against the walls of buildings. Chimneys smoke constantly. Boots leave wet marks near doorways. Wood must be cut and stored in enormous quantities where timber is available. Fuel becomes as important as food. Inside a boarding house, frost forms around the edges of windows. A stove glows in the center of the room. People gather close to it. The air smells of wool, damp leather, smoke stew, and kerosene. Outside, the temperature falls far below freezing. The town does not simply need to function. It needs to remain warm. That requirement shapes architecture. Entrances may be protected from wind. Buildings are positioned to reduce exposure where possible. Walls are insulated with available materials. Food freezes quickly if stored in the wrong place. Water becomes complicated. A bucket left outside may become useless. You notice another problem beneath the buildings. Permafrost. Ground that remains frozen for long periods can behave unpredictably when disturbed or warmed. Buildings placed directly on frozen soil may eventually shift if heat causes ice within the ground to melt. Later construction methods develop ways to reduce this problem, but early settlements often learned through experience. Floors tilt. Posts move. Doors stop closing properly. The ground itself changes beneath the house. This makes abandonment especially interesting. A wooden building may remain standing while slowly twisting out of shape. You walk through one abandoned mining camp in summer. Wildflowers grow beside leaning walls. Mosquitoes hum in the still air. The sun remains high late into the evening. A structure that endured decades of winter cold now seems strangely delicate beneath soft summer light. The mine entrance has collapsed. Rails disappear into vegetation. A rusted boiler sits beside a creek. Ore once justified bringing all this machinery into the wilderness. When the ore declined, removing the equipment cost money. so some of it stayed. This is one reason remote industrial ruins often contain heavy objects abandoned in place. The machine became less valuable than the journey required to take it somewhere else. You rest your hand on the rusted metal. It is cold even in summer. The object is a reminder that remoteness affects endings as much as beginnings. In the city, an old machine may be sold for scrap. Here it becomes archaeology. You continue toward another kind of northern settlement, a military installation. During the 20th century, Alaska's strategic position made it important for defense aviation radar and later Cold War monitoring. Airfields and military stations appeared in places with tiny civilian populations. Housing had to be built, fuel stored, food delivered, runways maintained, communication equipment protected from severe weather. A remote installation could resemble a small artificial town placed suddenly into tundra. You walk through one after its purpose has ended. A row of utilitarian buildings stands beside an empty road. Windows are boarded. A radio tower rises above everything. Wind moves through loose metal somewhere beyond the barracks. The silence feels almost mechanical. You enter what might once have been a mess hall. Loom tables are gone, but marks remain on the floor. You imagine ordinary evenings here, people eating from metal trays, coffee being poured, letters read from home, someone playing cards, someone complaining about the old. Military history often emphasizes strategy and technology, yet the daily life of an isolated station contains long stretches of waiting maintenance, cooking, cleaning, paperwork, and weather. Again, ordinary routines fill the forgotten place. Not every abandoned Alaskan settlement was created by outsiders. Some native villages have also relocated over time because of erosion flooding, changing economic conditions, infrastructure needs, or other pressures. This is very different from a temporary mining camp. A village may contain generations of family memory tied to a particular coastline or riverbank. Relocation therefore carries a deeper complexity. You approach one coastal site where buildings once stood closer to the sea. Erosion has removed part of the shore. The distance between houses and water has narrowed. Storms reach farther inland. In places built on permafrost warming, conditions can make erosion even more severe as frozen ground becomes less stable. Some communities have debated or pursued relocation because remaining in place becomes increasingly difficult. But moving an entire village is not simply moving houses. A cemetery may remain. Hunting routes remain tied to the older geography. Stories are connected to specific landmarks. A modern relocation plan can measure roads and buildings. It cannot easily measure belonging. Historians of the future may face uncertainty about the exact moment a community moved. Was it when the first houses relocated? When the school closed? When only elders remained? When the final family left? As you have learned throughout your journey, places rarely end cleanly. You continue toward a former fishing settlement on the coast. Processing buildings once stood beside the water. Boats arrived during seasonal runs. Workers came for several months, then left. Some communities were intensely populated only during part of the year. This creates another difficulty when historians try to estimate size. A settlement may have contained hundreds of people in summer and only a handful in winter. Which number describes it accurately? Both. Seasonal places resist simple definition. You walk past an empty bunkhouse. Rows of hooks remain along one wall. A faded number is painted beside a door. For several months each year, this room may have been crowded. Now the floor holds only windblown dust. Outside, gulls circle above the abandoned dock. The sea continues its own schedule. Fish return according to patterns far older than the buildings. Human settlement gathers around them, then sometimes disappears. Evening arrives, though in summer it barely becomes evening at all. The northern sun rests low above the horizon. Everything takes on a muted golden light. Mountains become blue in the distance. A river reflects the sky. You stand between the remains of several different Alaskas, an indigenous homeland, a trading route, a mining camp, a military station, a fishing settlement. Each layer depended on the same geography in a different way. One needed animal migrations, another needed river access, another needed ore, another needed a runway, another needed fish. When the reason for staying changed, the settlement changed with it. You walk toward the edge of the abandoned town. A final house stands beside a willow thicket. Its door is missing. Inside, someone once watched winter darkness through a frost-covered window. Perhaps they counted the weeks until spring. Perhaps they loved the silence. Perhaps they could not wait to leave. The records cannot tell you. The house remains quieter than any answer. Behind you lies almost an entire continent of forgotten places. Island villages, forest farms, mountain hollows, drowned towns, canal ports, railroad stops, prairie settlements, company towns, desert communities, trading posts, mining camps, coastal villages, park homesteads, island plantations, northern outposts. Ahead, there is only one section left. You turn south again, carrying all these scattered places with you. The final journey will not lead to one town. It will lead through the traces they all left behind. Old roads, orchards, foundations, cemeteries, walls, names on fading maps, the quiet evidence of people who expected their homes to last. Section 20. You turn south again, carrying with you the strange feeling that the country has become fuller rather than emptier. At the beginning of your journey, a forgotten place seemed like something missing. An abandoned island, a forest covering a farm, a road ending beneath water. Now you understand that disappearance is rarely so simple. Across America, places survive in fragments. A wall remains after the house disappears. A cemetery remains after the town disappears. A recipe remains after the language changes. A place name remains after almost everyone has forgotten why it was chosen. I begin this final walk along an old road beneath a quiet morning sky. There is nothing remarkable about the road at first. Grass grows along its center. Trees lean toward one another above it. Rain has softened the ruts, but you have learned to look more carefully. A line of stones appears beside the road. Farther ahead, an apple tree grows alone among maples. Then you notice a shallow rectangular hollow filled with leaves. A house stood here. Perhaps 100 years ago, you would have seen smoke rising through branches. Someone would have swept the doorway. A bucket might have rested near a well. Children could have followed this road toward school. The place did not know it would become historical. That may be the most important fact you have discovered. Most forgotten places were simply ordinary places while people lived there. Their residents did not wake each morning thinking they occupied a future ruin. They prepared breakfast. They worried about rain. They repaired fences. They waited for mail. They discussed prices. They planted trees. They wondered whether their children would stay nearby. Their lives felt present, just as yours does. You continue along the road until it reaches a cemetery. The stones are modest. Some remain upright. Others lean beneath years of frost and rain. Names repeat across generations. A person born in another country lies beside children born in America. A miner rests near a shopkeeper. A farmer lies beside someone whose occupation was never recorded. The cemetery outlasted the business district. You have seen this pattern again and again. Wooden buildings disappear quickly when nobody maintains them. Roof shingles loosen. Water enters. Floorboards rot. Walls lean. Fire may destroy what weather has not, but stone markers and foundations often remain much longer. For this reason, the dead sometimes preserve the geography of the living. A cemetery may reveal where a vanished town once stood even when no houses survive. You stand quietly among the stones. The air smells of grass and damp earth. A bird moves through a nearby hedge. Somewhere beyond the trees, traffic passes on a modern road. The sound feels distant. You move onward toward a crossroads. On an old map, a town name appears here. Today there is almost nothing. Perhaps a farmhouse, a mailbox, a small church. You search for the old center and find only an open field. This is another lesson your journey has offered. Maps preserve confidence better than reality. A printed name can suggest permanence. A net grid of streets can make a settlement appear substantial. Yet some planned towns never grew beyond a few buildings. Others flourished briefly and then vanished. A map captures intention as easily as achievement. You imagine the surveyor drawing straight streets across prairie or desert. Main Street, First Street, Church Street, perhaps dozens of building lots. The paper promises a future. A hotel may be planned, a station expected, a factory advertised. Then the railroad chooses another route. The mine disappoints investors. Water proves unreliable. The future remains on paper. The ground stays mostly empty. Historians often have to distinguish between the town people planned and the town people actually inhabited. That difference can be enormous. You follow the old map farther. A road leads toward a creek. There, beneath cottonwoods, you discover bridge abutments without a bridge. Two stone structures face one another across the water. Nothing connects them now. 4 decades wagons may have crossed here. Then a better route opened downstream. The bridge was dismantled or washed away. The road gradually disappeared. Yet the stone ends remain still facing each other like two people waiting to finish a conversation. Transportation has shaped almost every forgotten place you visited. A wagon road made an inn useful. A canal created a warehouse town. A railroad created a depot settlement. A highway bypassed a main street. A reservoir drowned a valley road. An airplane reduced the importance of an isolated northern port. Places often survive only as long as the routes connecting them remain useful. You walk through the abandoned alignment and notice how naturally the forest has accepted it. Roots cross the surface, leaves collect in the old wheel tracks. A fox could travel the road without knowing people built it. Nature rarely erases human work all at once. Instead, it repurposes it. A cellar becomes shelter for animals. A canal becomes wetland habitat. A railroad grade becomes a trail, or becomes a trail. An orchard becomes food for deer. A stone wall becomes a corridor through forest. An abandoned place joins another system. This is why the word ruin can sometimes feel too simple. Many forgotten places are still active landscapes, just not in the way their builders intended. You continue until afternoon light reaches a surviving apple orchard. The trees are old and irregular. Some branches have fallen, others still flower. Perhaps the original variety is now uncommon. Perhaps descendants of the family who planted it live hundreds of miles away. You pick up a fallen apple. It smells sharp and fresh. For a moment, the distance between past and present feels very small. Fruit trees are among the gentlest witnesses you have encountered. They were planted for the future. No buyer plants an orchard expecting only one season. A young tree represents patience. Years pass before it becomes fully productive. Planting one means trusting that someone will still be here later. That makes an abandoned orchard especially moving. The people left. The trees continued, keeping their appointment with spring. You place the apple back beneath the branches and continue. Farther ahead stands a house. Unlike most places you have visited, this one is occupied. Smoke rises from the chimney. A modern vehicle rests beside the porch. The building itself may be more than a century old. Perhaps it was moved from another settlement. Perhaps rooms were added, windows replaced, a roof changed. Our family turned an old structure into a new home. This reminds you that forgotten places do not always survive as museums. Sometimes they survive invisibly inside living communities. A former school becomes a residence. A company house becomes a private home. A depot becomes a shop. A warehouse becomes apartments. The building remains while its original purpose disappears. History can hide inside usefulness. You walk past without disturbing anyone. Soon you reach another old town site where almost everything is gone except the street names. One road still carries the name of a mill that vanished generations ago. Another remembers a family no longer living nearby. A creek has inherited the name of an early settlement. Language keeps geography alive. People may pronounce the name daily without knowing its origin. This is one of the quietest forms of survival. No monument, no preserved building, only a word. The same thing happens with food, music, and household custom. An immigrant recipe remains after the original language fades. A local expression survives after the industry that created it closes. A garden plant spreads from an abandoned yard into surrounding woods. History leaks outward. It refuses to remain neatly inside ruins. By late afternoon, you reach a hill overlooking a broad landscape. From here, you imagine every place you have visited appearing at once. Hog Island rises from the Atlantic. New England forests open into fields again. Appalachian chimneys regain their houses. Reservoir water lowers revealing roads and foundations. Mules return to canal towpaths. Great Lakes warehouses reopen their doors. Prairie stations hear trains approaching. Immigrant kitchens fill with familiar aromas. Company town whistles mark the end of a shift. Black-founded communities fill schools and churches. Desert irrigation ditches carry water again. Trading posts receive travelers. Railroad water towers refill steam locomotives. Mining camps glow beneath evening lamps. California piers extend toward waiting ships. Park meadows become farms and homesteads again. Hawaiian valleys fill with working fields and village paths. Northern Alaskan settlements brighten beneath long summer light. None of these places returns exactly as it was. You cannot restore every voice. You cannot know every name. Some questions remain unresolved. Was the store on this corner or the next? Who planted that tree? How many families remained during the final winter? Why did one household stay after everyone else left? The uncertainty has followed you from the first shoreline, and perhaps it belongs here. History is not peaceful because every mystery has been solved. It is peaceful because you can sit beside what remains without demanding that it reveal everything. You can notice. You can wonder. You can remember that ordinary lives deserve attention even when the details are incomplete. Evening begins, settling over the hill. The light turns warmer. Roads become thin lines in the distance. The country below you no longer seems divided into famous and forgotten places. Every landscape contains both. Beneath cities are older streets. Behind forests are fields. Under lakes are roads. Inside modern towns are buildings that once belonged to completely different communities. The past is not somewhere far behind you. It is underneath. Beside. Within. You take one last look across the landscape. Nothing moves quickly. A breeze touches the grass. Somewhere a bird calls once. The road ahead descends gently into evening, and now there is no need to search for another forgotten town. You have learned how to recognize them. Word count Alvamadisuk. You continue down the hill very slowly. The journey has been long and the roads behind you are beginning to soften in the fading light. You no longer need to remember every town name. You do not need to hold every date. Let the details settle wherever they wish. Perhaps one image remains, an apple tree beside a vanished house. Perhaps you remember the sound of canal water beneath a lock gate, or a railroad platform waiting beneath the enormous prairie sky. Maybe it is simply a lamp glowing inside a wooden house on an island that no longer exists in quite the same shape. These places can remain there quietly. No one is asking you to rebuild them tonight. The abandoned roads do not need to reach their destinations. The old stores may stay closed. The whistles have already faded. The gardens can rest beneath grass. You walk more slowly now. The evening air is cool and gentle. Far behind you, mountains become dark shapes beneath the sky. A river carries the last reflection of sunset. Trees move almost imperceptibly in the breeze. You imagine windows going dark one by one across all those forgotten communities. A family finishes supper. Someone places another piece of wood on the fire. A child is carried toward bed. A shopkeeper closes the door. A horse settles inside a barn. At a distant station, the final train has already passed. At the coast, the tide comes quietly in. Nothing else needs to happen. The old roads can sleep beneath leaves. The drowned streets can rest beneath water. The desert walls can cool beneath stars. The northern settlements can disappear into soft snow. And somewhere beyond your thoughts, morning will eventually return to every landscape you visited. But you do not need to follow it there. For now, the forgotten door can close gently behind you. The library is quiet again. The lamps are low. History has said enough for one night.